How did we go from knowing that the best athletes in the ancient Greek Olympics must have consumed a plant-based diet to fearing that vegetarians don't get enough protein? How did we get to a place where the healers of our society, our doctors, know little, if anything, about nutrition, where our medical institutions denigrate the subject, where using prescription drugs and going to hospitals is the third leading cause of death? People are beginning to understand the conclusions of scientific literature and are changing their lives for the better. Never before has there been such a mountain of empirical research supporting a whole foods plant-based diet. Now, for example, we can obtain images of the arteries in the heart and then show conclusively, as Drs. Dean Ornish and Cadwell Esselstyn Jr. have done, that a whole foods plant-based diet reverses heart disease. Today I am reading to you my highlights of the China study, revised and expanded edition, the most comprehensive study of nutrition ever conducted, and the startling implications for diet, weight loss, and long-term health, written by T. Colin Campbell and Thomas M. Campbell II. By any number of measures, America's health is failing. We spend far more per capita on healthcare than any other society in the world, yet 2/3 of Americans are overweight, and over 25 million Americans have diabetes, an increase of about 10 million since the first edition of this book. To make matters worse, we are leading our youth down a path of disease earlier and earlier in their lives. 1/3 of the young people in this country are overweight or at risk of becoming overweight. Increasingly, they are falling prey to a form of diabetes that used to be seen only in adults, and these young people now take more prescription drugs than ever before. These issues all come down to 3 things: breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Part 1. The China study. Problems we face. Solutions we need. If nutrition were better understood and prevention and natural treatments were more accepted in the medical community, we would not be pouring so many toxic, potentially lethal drugs into our bodies at the last stage of disease. We would not be frantically searching for the new medicine that alleviates the symptoms, but often does nothing to address the fundamental causes of our illnesses. We would not be spending our money developing, patenting, and commercializing magic bullet drugs that often cause additional health problems. The current system has not lived up to its Hippocratic oath to do no harm. It is time to shift our thinking toward a broader perspective on health, one that includes a proper understanding and use of good nutrition. Although many of us think we're well informed on nutrition, we're not. We tend to follow one faddish diet after another. We disdain saturated fats, butter, or carbohydrates, and then embrace vitamin E, calcium supplements, aspirin, or zinc, and focus our energy and effort on extremely specific food components, as if this will unlock the secrets of health. All too often, fancy outweighs fact. We pin our efforts and our hopes on one isolated nutrient at a time, whether it is vitamin A to prevent cancer or vitamin E to prevent heart attacks. We oversimplify and disregard the infinite complexity of nature. Often, investigating minute biochemical parts of food and trying to reach broad conclusions about diet and health leads to contradictory results. Contradictory results lead to confused scientists and policymakers, and to an increasingly confused public. If you are only interested in a 2-week menu plan to lose weight, then this book is not for you. I am appealing to your intelligence, not to your ability to follow a recipe or menu plan. I want to offer you a more profound and more beneficial way to view health. I have a prescription for maximum health that is simple, easy to follow, and offers more benefits than any drug or surgery, without any of the side effects. So what is my prescription for good health? In short, it is about the multiple health benefits of consuming whole, plant-based foods, and the largely unappreciated health dangers of consuming animal-based foods, including all types of meat, dairy, and eggs. I did not begin with preconceived ideas, philosophical or otherwise, to prove the worthiness of whole foods, plant-based diets. I started at the opposite end of the spectrum as a meat-loving dairy farmer in my personal life and an establishment scientist in my professional life. I even used to lament the views of vegetarians as I taught nutritional biochemistry to pre-med students. Changing dietary practices will only occur and be maintained when people believe the evidence and experience the benefits. Both Tom and I have come to see that the benefits produced by eating a plant-based diet are far more diverse and impressive than any drug or surgery used in medical practice. Heart diseases, cancers, diabetes, stroke and hypertension, arthritis, cataracts, Alzheimer's disease, impotence, and all sorts of other chronic diseases may often be prevented. These diseases, which generally occur with aging and tissue degeneration, kill the majority of us before our time. Additionally, impressive evidence now exists to show that advanced heart disease, cancers of certain types, diabetes, and a few other degenerative diseases might be reversed by diet. Funding of genetic research continues to spiral upwards in the belief that specific genes account for the occurrence of specific diseases, in the hope that we somehow will be able to turn off these nasty genes. Drug company public relations programs now depict a future where each of us will have a personal ID card cataloging all of our good and bad genes. Using this card, we will be expected to go to our doctor, who will prescribe a single pill to suppress our bad genes. I strongly suspect these miracles will never be realized, or if tried, they will have serious unintended consequences. These futuristic pipe dreams obscure the affordable, efficacious health solutions that currently exist, solutions based in nutrition. In my own laboratory, we have shown in experimental animals that cancer growth can be turned on and off by nutrition, despite a very strong genetic predisposition. A house of proteins. In the 19th century, protein was synonymous with meat, and this connection has stayed with us for well over 100 years and has had enormous consequences for our dietary beliefs and practices. A culture of bias has become firmly entrenched. If you were civilized, you ate plenty of protein. If you were rich, you ate meat, and if you were poor, you ate staple plant foods like potatoes and bread. The lower classes were considered by some to be lazy and inept as a result of not eating enough meat or protein. Elitism and arrogance dominated much of the burgeoning field of nutrition in the 19th century. Protein, fat, carbohydrate, and alcohol provide virtually all of the calories that we consume. Fat, carbohydrate, and protein, as macronutrients, make up almost all the weight of food, aside from water, with the remaining small amount being the vitamin and mineral micronutrients. The amount of these latter micronutrients needed for optimum health are tiny, milligrams to micrograms. Protein, the most sacred of all nutrients, is a vital component of our bodies, and there are hundreds of thousands of different kinds. They function as enzymes, hormones, structural tissue, and transport molecules, all of which make life possible. Proteins are constructed as long chains of hundreds or thousands of amino acids, of which there are 15 to 20 different kinds, depending on how they are counted. Proteins wear out on a regular basis and must be replaced. This is accomplished by consuming foods that contain protein. When digested, these proteins give us a whole new supply of amino acid building blocks to use in making new protein replacements for those that wore out. About 8 amino acids, colored beads, that are needed for making our tissue proteins must be provided by the food we eat. They are called essential because our bodies cannot make them. If, like our string of beads, our food protein lacks enough of even one of these 8 essential amino acids, then the synthesis of the new proteins will be slowed down or stopped. This is where the idea of protein quality comes into play. Food proteins of the highest quality are, very simply, those that provide upon digestion the right kinds and amounts of amino acids needed to efficiently synthesize our new tissue proteins. Among animal foods, the proteins of milk and eggs represent the best amino acid matches for our proteins and thus are considered the highest quality. While the lower quality plant proteins may be lacking in one or more of these essential amino acids, as a group they do contain all of them. There is a mountain of compelling research showing that quote-unquote low quality plant protein, which allows for slow but steady synthesis of new proteins, is the healthiest type of protein. The protein gap stipulates that world hunger and malnutrition among children in the developing world was a result of not having enough protein to consume, especially high quality, i.e. animal protein. According to this view, those in the developing world were especially deficient in high quality protein or animal protein. The peanut is a legume like alfalfa, soybeans, clover, peas, and other beans. Like these other nitrogen fixers, peanuts are rich in protein. Peanuts often were contaminated with a fungus-produced toxin called aflatoxin. It was an alarming problem because aflatoxin was being shown to cause liver cancer in rats. It was said to be the most potent chemical carcinogen ever discovered. We wanted to know which foods contained the most aflatoxin. We learned that peanuts and corn were the foods most contaminated. All 29 jars of peanut butter we had purchased in the local groceries, for example, were contaminated with levels of aflatoxin as much as 300 times the amount judged to be acceptable in US food. Whole peanuts were much less contaminated. None exceeded the aflatoxin amounts allowed in US commodities. The children who got liver cancer were from the best fed families. The families with the most money ate what we thought were the healthiest diets, the diets most like our own meaty American diets. They consumed more protein than anyone else in the country, high quality animal protein at that, and yet they were the ones getting liver cancer. A research paper from India surfaced in an obscure medical journal. It was an experiment involving liver cancer and protein consumption in two groups of laboratory rats. One group was given aflatoxin and then fed diets containing 20% protein. The second group was given the same level of aflatoxin and then fed diets containing only 5% protein. Every single rat fed 20% protein got liver cancer or its precursor lesions, but not a single animal fed a 5% protein diet got liver cancer or its precursor lesions. It was not a trivial difference, it was 100% versus 0. Proof in science is elusive. Even more than the core sciences of biology, chemistry, and physics, establishing absolute proof in medicine and health is nearly impossible. The primary objective of research investigation is to determine only what is likely to be true. This is because research into health is inherently statistical. As we do observational and interventional research, we begin to amass the findings and weigh the evidence for or against a certain hypothesis. When the weight of the evidence favors an idea so strongly that it can no longer be plausibly denied, we advance the idea as a likely truth. Correlation does not equal causation. This does not mean that correlations are useless. When they are properly interpreted, correlations can be effectively used to study nutrition and health relationships. The China study, for example, has over 8,000 statistically significant correlations, and this is of immense value. When so many correlations like this are available, researchers can begin to identify patterns of relationships between diet, lifestyle, and disease. These patterns, in turn, are representative of how diet and health processes, which are usually complex, truly operate. However, if someone wants to prove that a single factor causes a single outcome, a correlation is not good enough. Statistical significance It's the odds that the correlation or other finding is real, that it isn't just random chance. A finding is said to be statistically significant when there is less than 5% probability that it is due to chance. This means, for example, that there is a 95% chance that we will get the same result if the study is repeated. This 95% cutoff point is arbitrary, but it is the standard nonetheless. Another arbitrary cutoff point is 99%. In this case, when the result meets this test, it is said to be highly statistically significant. By accumulating and analyzing a large body of combined data, the result can have considerably more weight. Meta-analysis findings are therefore more substantial than the findings of single research studies, although as with everything else, there may be exceptions. After obtaining the results from a variety of studies, we can then begin to use these tools and concepts to assess the weight of the evidence. Through this effort, we can begin to understand what is most likely to be true, and we can behave accordingly. Alternative hypotheses no longer seem plausible, and we can be very confident in the result. Absolute proof in the technical sense is unattainable and unimportant, but common sense proof, 99% certainty, is attainable and critical. Turning off cancer. Cancer proceeds through 3 stages: initiation, promotion, and progression. To use a rough analogy, the cancer process is similar to planting a lawn. Initiation is when you put the seeds in the soil, promotion is when the grass starts to grow, and progression is when the grass gets completely out of control, invading the driveway, the shrubbery, and the sidewalk. So what is the process that successfully implants the grass seed in the soil in the first place, that is, initiates cancer-prone cells? Chemicals that do this are called carcinogens. These chemicals are most often the byproduct of industrial processes, although small amounts may be formed in nature, as is the case with aflatoxin. These carcinogens genetically transform or mutate normal cells into cancer-prone cells. A mutation involves permanent alteration of the genes of the cell, with damage to its DNA. The entire initiation stage can take place in a very short period of time, even minutes. It is the time required for the chemical carcinogen to be consumed, absorbed into the blood, transported into cells, changed into its active product, bonded to DNA, and passed on to the daughter cells. When the new daughter cells are formed, the process is complete. These daughter cells and all their progeny will forever be genetically damaged, giving rise to the potential for cancer. Except in rare instances, completion of the initiation phase is considered irreversible. Promotion is reversible depending on whether the early cancer growth is given the right conditions in which to grow. This is where certain dietary factors become so important. These dietary factors, called promoters, feed cancer growth. Other dietary factors, called anti-promoters, slow cancer growth. Cancer growth flourishes when there are more promoters than anti-promoters. When anti-promoters prevail, cancer growth slows or stops. It is a push-pull process. A developing cancer tumor may wander away from its initial site in the body and invade neighboring or distant tissues. When the cancer takes on these deadly properties, it is considered malignant. When it actually breaks away from its initial home and wanders, it is metastasizing. This final stage of cancer results in death. Decreasing protein intake, like that done in the original research in India, 20% to 5%, not only greatly decreased enzyme activity, but did so very quickly. What does that mean? Decreasing enzyme activity via low-protein diets implied that less aflatoxin was being transformed into the dangerous aflatoxin metabolite that had the potential to bind and to mutate the DNA. From our extensive research, one idea seemed to be clear. Lower protein intake dramatically decreased tumor initiation. Foci are precursor clusters of cells that grow into tumors. Although most foci do not become full-blown tumor cells, they are predictive of tumor development. Foci development was almost entirely dependent on how much protein was consumed, regardless of how much aflatoxin was consumed. Animals starting with the most cancer initiation, high aflatoxin dose, developed substantially less foci when fed the 5% protein diet. In contrast, animals initiated with a low aflatoxin dose actually produced substantially more foci when subsequently fed the 20% protein diet. Foci growth could be reversed up and down by switching the amount of protein being consumed, and at all stages of foci development. Foci developed only when the animals met or exceeded the amount of dietary protein, 12%, needed to satisfy their body growth rate. That is, when the animals met and surpassed their requirement for protein, disease onset began. This finding may have considerable relevance for humans, even though these were rat studies. I say this because the protein required for growth in young rats and humans, as well as the protein required to maintain health for adult rats and humans, is remarkably similar. According to the recommended daily allowance, RDA, for protein consumption, we humans should be getting about 10% of our energy from protein. This is considerably more than the actual amount required, about 5 to 6%. But because requirements may vary from individual to individual, 10% dietary protein is recommended to ensure adequate intake for virtually all people. The average American consumes 15 to 16% protein, while the government recommends levels as high as 17 to 21%. 10% dietary protein is equivalent to eating about 50 to 60 grams of protein per day, depending on body weight and total calorie intake. The national average of 15 to 16% is about 70 to 100 grams of protein per day. And the animals fed the 20% level of protein. Foci increased in number and size as expected when the aflatoxin dose was increased. The dose-response relationship was strong and clear. However, in the animals fed 5% protein, the dose-response curve completely disappeared. There was no foci response even when animals were given the maximum tolerated aflatoxin dose. This was yet another result demonstrating that a low-protein diet could override the cancer-causing effect of a very powerful carcinogen, aflatoxin. For all of these experiments, we were using casein, which makes up 80 to 85% of cow's milk protein. So the next logical question was whether plant protein, tested in the same way, has the same effect on cancer promotion as casein. The answer is an astonishing no. In these experiments, plant protein did not promote cancer growth, even at the higher levels of intake. The effects of protein feeding on tumor development were nothing less than spectacular. Rats generally live for about 2 years, thus the study was 100 weeks in length. All animals that were administered aflatoxin and fed the regular 20% levels of casein either were dead or near death from liver tumors at 100 weeks. All animals administered the same level of aflatoxin but fed the low 5% protein diet were alive and active with sleek hair coats at 100 weeks. This was a virtual 100 to 0 score, something almost never seen in research and almost identical to the original research in India. The depth and consistency of these findings strongly suggest that they are relevant for humans for 4 reasons. First, rats and humans have an almost identical need for protein. Second, protein operates in humans virtually the same way it does in rats. Third, the level of protein intake causing tumor growth is the same level that humans consume. And fourth, in both rodents and humans, the initiation stage is far less important than the promotion stage of cancer. Although there are strong arguments that these provocative findings are qualitatively relevant to human health, we cannot know the quantitative relevance. In other words, are these principles regarding animal protein and cancer critically important for all humans in all situations, or are they merely marginally important for a minority of people in fairly unique situations? Are these principles involved in 1,000 human cancers every year, 1 million human cancers every year, or more? We needed direct evidence from human research. Lessons from China. Some cancers were much more common in some places than in others. Earlier studies had set the stage for this idea, showing that cancer incidence also varies widely between different countries. But these China data were more remarkable because the geographic variations in cancer rates were much greater. They also occurred in a country where 87% of the population is the same ethnic group, the Han people. The authors of a major review on diet and cancer, prepared for the US Congress in 1981, estimated that genetics only determines about 2 to 3% of total cancer risk. Cancer rates in the counties with the highest rates of some cancers were more than 100 times greater than in counties with the lowest rates of these cancers. These are truly remarkable figures. By way of comparison, we in the US see at most 2 to 3 times the cancer rates from one part of the country to another. Because China is relatively homogeneous genetically, it was clear that these differences had to be explained by environmental causes. We decided to make the study as comprehensive as possible. From the Cancer Atlas, we had access to disease mortality rates for more than 4 dozen different kinds of disease, including individual cancers, heart disease, and infectious diseases. We gathered data from 367 variables and then compared each variable with every other variable. We went into 65 counties across China and administered questionnaires and blood tests on 6,500 adults. We took urine samples, directly measured everything families ate over a 3-day period, and analyzed food samples from marketplaces around the country. When we were done, we had more than 8,000 statistically significant associations between lifestyle, diet, and disease variables. We had a study that was unmatched in terms of comprehensiveness, quality, and uniqueness. In America, an average of 15 to 16% of our total calories comes from protein, and upwards of 81% of this amount comes from animal-based foods. But in rural China, only 9 to 10% of total calories comes from protein, and only 10% of this protein comes from animal-based foods. For an American adult male of 77 kilograms, calorie intake will be about 2,400 calories per day. For an average rural Chinese adult male of 77 kilograms, calorie intake will be about 3,000 calories per day. There are massive dietary differences between the Chinese and American experiences. Much more overall calories, less fat, less protein, much less animal foods, more fiber, and much more iron are consumed in China. These dietary differences are supremely important. In effect, we were comparing with the Chinese range diets rich in plant-based foods to diets very rich in plant-based foods. In almost all other studies, all of which are Western, scientists are comparing diets rich in animal-based foods to diets very rich in animal-based foods. The difference between rural Chinese diets and Western diets and the ensuing disease patterns is enormous. It was this distinction, as much as any other, that made this study so important. Because all diseases are biological processes gone awry, we can assume that whatever causes are observed, they will eventually operate through biological events. When these diseases were cross-listed in a way that allowed every disease rate to be compared with every other disease rate, 2 groups of diseases emerged. Those typically found in more economically developed areas, diseases of affluence, and those typically found in rural agricultural areas, diseases of poverty. Disease groupings observed in rural China. Disease of affluence, nutritional extravagance. We have cancers of the colon, lung, breast, leukemia, childhood brain, stomach and liver cancer. Diabetes, coronary heart disease. And we have disease of poverty, nutritional inadequacy and poor sanitation. Pneumonia, intestinal obstruction, peptic ulcer, digestive disease, pulmonary tuberculosis, parasitic disease, rheumatic heart disease, metabolic and endocrine disease, other than diabetes, diseases of pregnancy, and many others. As a developing population accumulates wealth, people change their eating habits, lifestyles, and sanitation systems. As wealth accumulates, more and more people die from rich diseases of affluence than poor diseases of poverty. Because these diseases of affluence are so tightly linked to eating habits, diseases of affluence might be better named diseases of nutritional extravagance. The vast majority of people in the United States and other Western countries die from diseases of affluence. For this reason, these diseases are often referred to as Western diseases. We compared the prevalence of Western diseases with diet and lifestyle variables, and to our surprise, one of the strongest predictors of Western diseases was blood cholesterol. Whoopsie. As blood cholesterol levels in rural China rose in certain counties, the incidence of Western diseases also increased. What made this so surprising was that Chinese levels were far lower than we had expected. The average level of blood cholesterol was only 127 milligrams per deciliter, which is almost 100 points less than the American average, 215 milligrams per deciliter. Lower blood cholesterol levels are linked to lower rates of heart disease, cancer, and other Western diseases, even at levels far below those considered safe in the West. As blood cholesterol levels decreased from 170 milligrams per deciliter to 90 milligrams per deciliter, cancers of the liver, rectum, colon, male lung, female lung, breast, childhood leukemia, childhood brain, adult brain, stomach, and esophagus, throat decreased. At the time of our study, the death rate from coronary heart disease was 17 times higher among American men than rural Chinese men. The American death rate from breast cancer was 5 times higher than the rural Chinese rate. Even more remarkable were the extraordinarily low rates of coronary heart disease in the southwestern Chinese provinces of Sichuan and Guizhou. During a 3-year observation period, 1973 to 1975, not one single person died of coronary heart disease before the age of 64 among 246,000 men in a Guizhou county and 181,000 women in a Sichuan county. Consuming animal-based protein increases blood cholesterol levels. Saturated fat and dietary cholesterol also associate with blood cholesterol, although these nutrients are not as effective as animal protein. In contrast, plant-based foods contain no cholesterol and in varied ways help to decrease the amount of cholesterol made by the body. On average, we consume 35 to 40% of our total calories as fat. We have been consuming high-fat diets like this since the late 19th century, and at the onset of our Industrial Revolution. Because we had more money, we began consuming more meat and dairy, which are relatively high in fat. We were demonstrating our affluence by consuming such foods. Then came the mid to late 20th century when scientists began to question the advisability of consuming diets so high in fat. National and international dietary recommendations emerged to suggest that we should decrease our fat intake to or below 30% of calories. That lasted for a couple decades, but now the fears surrounding high-fat diets are abating. Some authors of popular books even advocate increased fat intake. Some experienced researchers have suggested that it is not necessary to go below 30% fat as long as we consume the right kind of fat. The level of 30% fat has become a benchmark, even though there is no evidence to suggest that this is a vital threshold. With a few exceptions, animal-based foods contain considerably more fat than plant-based foods. This is well illustrated by comparing the amounts of fat in the diets of different countries. Fat and animal protein intake are more than 90% correlated. This means that fat intake increases in parallel with animal protein intake, which further means that dietary fat is an indicator of how much animal-based foods is in the diet. Breast cancer was associated with animal fat intake, but not with plant fat. The correlation between dietary fat and animal protein in rural China was very high, at 70 to 84%, similar to the 93% seen when comparing different countries. This is important because in China and the international studies, fat consumption was only an indication of animal-based food consumption. Thus, the association between fat and breast cancer might really be telling us that as consumption of animal-based foods goes up, so does breast cancer. This is not the case in the US, where we selectively add or remove fat from our foods and our diets. We get as much or more fat from plant-based food, potato chips, French fries, as we get from processed animal-based foods, skim milk, lean cuts of meat. The much later age of menarche in rural China is remarkable. 25 women in each of the 130 villages in the survey were asked when they had their first menstrual period. The range of village averages was 15 to 19 years, with an average of 17 years. The US average is roughly 11 years. Because the length of the reproductive life of a Chinese woman is only about 75% of that of the British or American woman, this means that with lower estrogen levels, the Chinese woman only experiences about 35 to 40% of lifetime estrogen exposure of British and American women. This corresponds to Chinese breast cancer rates that are only 1/5 of those of Western women. The strong association of high animal protein, high fat diet with reproductive hormones and early age of menarche, both of which raise the risk of breast cancer, is an important observation. It makes clear that we should not have our children consume diets high in animal-based foods. Dietary fiber is exclusively found in plant-based foods. This material, which gives rigidity to the cell walls of plants, comes in thousands of different chemical variations. It is mostly made of highly complex carbohydrate molecules. We digest very little or no fiber. Nonetheless, fiber, having few or no calories itself, helps dilute the caloric density of our diets, creates a sense of fullness, and helps to shut down appetite, among other things. In doing so, it satisfies our hunger and minimizes the overconsumption of calories. There was no evidence showing that increasing fiber intake impaired iron absorption in the body. In fact, we found the opposite effect. A good indicator of how much iron is in the blood, hemoglobin, actually increased with greater intakes of dietary fiber. As it turns out, high-fiber foods like wheat and corn, but not the polished rice consumed in China, also happen to be high in iron, meaning that the higher the consumption of fiber, the higher the consumption of iron. Iron intake in rural China, 34 milligrams per day, was surprisingly high when compared to the average American intake, 18 milligrams per day, and it was far more associated with plant-based foods than with animal-based foods. High fiber intake was consistently associated with lower rates of cancers of the rectum and colon. High fiber intakes also were associated with lower levels of blood cholesterol. Of course, high fiber consumption reflected high plant-based food consumption. Foods such as beans, leafy vegetables, and whole grains are all high in fiber. Antioxidants are usually colored because the same chemical property that sponges up excess electrons also creates visible colors. Some of these antioxidants are called carotenoids. of which there are hundreds. They vary in color from the yellow color of beta-carotene, squash, to the red color of lycopene, tomatoes, to the orange color of the odd-sounding cryptoxanthins, oranges. Other antioxidants may be colorless, and these include chemicals such as ascorbic acid, vitamin C, and vitamin E, which act as antioxidants in other parts of plants that need to be protected from the hazards of wayward electrons. We produce low levels of free radicals throughout our lifetime. Simply being exposed to the sun's rays, to certain industrial pollutants, and to improperly balanced nutrient intakes creates a background of unwanted free radical damage. Free radicals are nasty. They can cause our tissues to become rigid and limited in their function. It is a bit like old age when our bodies become creaky and stiff. To a great extent, this is what aging is. This uncontrolled free radical damage also is a part of the processes that give rise to cataracts, to hardening of the arteries, to cancer, to emphysema, to arthritis, and many other ailments that become more common with age. When levels of vitamin C in the blood were low, these families were more likely to have a high incidence of cancer. Low vitamin C was prominently associated with higher risk for esophageal cancer, leukemia, and cancers of the nasopharynx, breast, stomach, liver, rectum, colon, and lung. The authors of these books advocate keeping dietary carbohydrates as low as 15 to 20% of total calories. By definition, this means that they are advocating very high-fat, high-protein diets. The only way to make up for the other 80 to 85% of calories is through fat and protein. Simply by looking at the numbers, anybody can see that America has not adopted the low-fat experiment, not by any stretch of the imagination. In fact, the claim that the low-fat brainwashing experiment has been tried and failed is often the first of many statements of fact in current diet books that can be described either as severe ignorance or opportunistic deceit. It is difficult to know where to begin to refute the maze of misinformation and false promises commonly made by authors completely untrained in nutrition, authors who have never conducted any peer-reviewed, professionally based experimental research. And yet these books are immensely popular. Why? Because people do lose weight, at least in the short term. People are notoriously unsuccessful at significantly restricting their energy intake over any long period of time, and that is why there has yet to be a long-term study that shows success with the low-carb diets. In the same study funded by the Atkins Group, researchers report at some point during the 24 weeks, 28 subjects, 68% reported constipation, 63% reported bad breath, 51% reported headache, 10% noted hair loss, and one woman, 1%, reported increased menstrual bleeding. Additionally, they found that the dieters had a stunning 53% increase in the amount of calcium they excreted in their urine, which may spell disaster for their bone health. The weight loss, some of which is simply initial fluid loss, may come with a very high price. A 2013 meta-analysis of 17 well-performed studies, totaling 272,216 subjects, concluded that there was a 31% increase in total deaths for those using diets lower in carbohydrates. Most of the carbohydrates we consume are from fruits, vegetables, and grains. These natural carbohydrates are composed of long chains of simpler carbohydrate molecules and are digested, broken down, in a controlled, regulated manner to yield the simpler molecules, e.g. sucrose, as in table sugar, for subsequent metabolism. Complex carbohydrates include the many forms of dietary fiber, almost all of which remain undigested while still providing substantial health benefits. Our intemperate consumption of refined carbohydrates is why carbohydrates as a whole have gotten such a bad rap. The vast majority of carbohydrates consumed in America are found in junk food or grains so refined that to convince consumers they carry any claim to healthfulness at all, they must be supplemented with vitamins and minerals, consumption of which is not as effective as in their natural form in whole foods. You could eat a low-fat, high-carbohydrate diet by exclusively eating the following foods: pasta made from refined flour, baked potato chips, soda, sugary cereals, and low-fat candy bars. Eating this way is a bad idea. You will not derive the health benefits of a plant-based diet eating these foods, because they are not in whole food form. Average calorie intake per kilogram of body weight was 30% higher among the least active Chinese than among average Americans, yet body weight was 20% lower. Provided that we aren't restricting our calorie intake, those of us who consume a high-fat, high-protein diet simply retain more calories than we need. We store these calories as body fat, perhaps weave it into our muscle fibers, we call it marbling in beef animals, and perhaps store it in the more obvious places like our butt, our midsection, or around our face and upper thighs. Here's the clincher. Only a small amount of calories needs to be retained by our body to cause significant change in body weight. For example, if we retain only an extra 50 calories per day, this can lead to an extra 10 pounds per year. You may not think that this is a lot, but over a period of 5 years, that's an extra 50 pounds. Despite any short-term caloric restriction regimes we may follow, our body, through many mechanisms, will ultimately choose how many calories to take in and what to do with them. Our attempts to limit calorie intake are short-lived and imprecise, whether we do it by limiting carbohydrates or fat. Consuming diets high in protein and fat transfers calories away from their conversion into body heat to their storage form as body fat, unless severe calorie restrictions causing weight loss. In contrast, diets low in protein and fat cause calories to be lost as body heat. We saw the same phenomenon in our experimental animals fed the low-protein diets. They routinely consumed slightly more calories, gained less weight, disposed of the extra calories as body heat, and voluntarily exercised more, while still having far less cancer than animals on standard diets. We found that calories were burned at a faster rate and transformed into body heat as more oxygen was consumed. Animal protein consumption was associated with taller and heavier people, but was also associated with higher levels of total and bad cholesterol. Furthermore, body weight associated with animal protein intake was associated with more cancer and more coronary heart disease. It seems that being bigger, and presumably better, comes with very high costs. Greater plant protein intake was closely linked to greater height and body weight. Body growth is linked to protein in general, and both animal and plant proteins are effective. People chronically infected with hepatitis B virus also had an increased risk of liver cancer, but our findings suggested those who were infected with the virus and who were simultaneously eating more animal-based foods had higher cholesterol levels and more liver cancer than those infected with the virus and not consuming animal-based foods. Everything in food works together to create health or disease. The more we think that a single chemical characterizes a whole food, the more we stray into idiocy. Since publication of the first edition, some self-anointed scientists have spoken of the conclusions of this book as if they were drawn solely from our findings in rural China. Nonsense. This chapter alone addresses our findings from rural China. The rest of this book draws on the findings from my own laboratory and the findings from many, many other research groups. It is the breadth of this evidence, from basic to applied research, from far-ranging experimental study designs, from information on how public policy frames the difficulties of science reporting, that adds weight to the evidence that informs my interpretation on our findings in China. Virtually all of the evidence on how diet and nutrition works to produce health or disease is reductionist evidence, because reductionism is the normal strategy for doing this research. We mostly study hypotheses in isolation, nutrients out of their natural context, mechanisms as if they are singular events, and specific diseases as if they bore little or no relationship to other health outcomes. These reductionist details are important when used to construct the fabric of the whole. However, they are the source of great confusion when interpreted outside of the whole of which they are a part. Part 2. Diseases of affluence. We eat like feasting kings and queens every day of the week, and it kills us. You probably know people who suffer from heart disease, cancer, stroke, Alzheimer's, obesity, or diabetes. There is no such thing as a special diet for cancer and a different, equally special diet for heart disease. The evidence now amassed from researchers around the world shows that the same diet that is good for the prevention of cancer is also good for the prevention of heart disease, as well as obesity, diabetes, cataracts, macular degeneration, Alzheimer's, cognitive dysfunction, multiple sclerosis, osteoporosis, and other diseases. Furthermore, this diet seems to benefit everyone, regardless of his or her genes or personal dispositions. Broken hearts. The heart is the centerpiece of life, and more often than not in America, it is the centerpiece of death. Malfunction of the heart and or circulatory system will kill 40% of Americans, more than those killed by any other injury or ailment, including cancer. Heart disease has been our number one cause of death for almost 100 years. What is heart disease? One of the key components is plaque. Plaque is a greasy layer of proteins, fats, including cholesterol, immune system cells, and other components that accumulate on the inner walls of the coronary arteries. I have heard one surgeon say that if you wipe your finger on a plaque-covered artery, it has the same feel as wiping your finger across a warm cheesecake. If you have plaque building up in your coronary arteries, you have some degree of heart disease. If the plaque on the inner wall of the artery accumulates slowly over several years, blood flow has time to adjust. Think of blood flowing through your artery as a raging river. If you put a few stones on the sides of a river every day over a period of years, like plaque accumulating on the walls of the artery, the water will find another way to get where it wants to be. It's the less severe accumulations of plaque, blocking under 50% of the artery, that often cause heart attacks. These accumulations each have a layer of cells called the cap, which separates the core of the plaque from the blood flowing by. In the dangerous plaques, the cap is weak and thin. As blood rushes by, it can erode the cap until it ruptures. When the cap ruptures, the core contents of the plaque mix with the blood. The blood then begins clotting around the site of rupture. The clot grows and can quickly block the entire artery. When the artery becomes blocked over such a short period of time, there is little chance for collateral blood flow to develop. When this happens, blood flow downstream of the rupture is severely reduced, and the heart muscles don't get the oxygen they require. At this point, the heart muscle cells start to die, heart pumping mechanisms begin to fail, and the person may feel a crushing pain in the chest or a searing pain down into an arm and up into the neck and jaw. In short, the victim starts to die. This is the process behind most of the 1.1 million heart attacks that occur in America every year. 1 out of 3 people who have a heart attack will die from it. The shining jewel of the Framingham study is its findings on blood cholesterol. In 1961, they convincingly showed a strong correlation between high blood cholesterol and heart disease. Researchers noted that men with cholesterol levels over 244 milligrams per deciliter have more than 3 times the incidence of coronary heart disease as do those with cholesterol levels less than 210 milligrams per deciliter. Japanese men who live in Hawaii or California have a much higher blood cholesterol level and incidence of coronary heart disease than Japanese men living in Japan. The cause is clearly environmental, as most of these people have the same genetic heritage. Smoking habits are not the cause, because men in Japan, who are more likely to smoke, still had less coronary heart disease than the Japanese Americans. The researchers pointed to diet, writing that blood cholesterol increased with dietary intake of saturated fat, animal protein, and dietary cholesterol. We now know that the attention paid to fat and cholesterol was misguided. The possibility that no one wanted to consider was that fat and cholesterol were merely indicators of animal food intake. The more animal protein you eat, the more heart disease you have. In addition, dozens of experimental studies show that feeding rats, rabbits, and pigs animal protein, e.g. casein, dramatically raises cholesterol levels, whereas plant protein, e.g. soy protein, dramatically lowers cholesterol levels. Studies in humans not only mirror these findings, but also show that eating plant protein has even greater power to lower cholesterol levels than reducing fat or cholesterol intake. A conceptual revolution was taking place, and a lot of people didn't like it. Even talking about diet was too much for many scientists. Preventing heart disease by diet was a threatening idea because it implied that something about the good old meaty American diet was so bad for us that it was destroying our hearts. The unfortunate association of meat with physical ability, general manliness, sexual identity, and economic wealth all cloud how the status quo scientists view food, regardless of the health evidence. Since the first edition of this book, a highly energized discussion has erupted on the internet and in the media, in which popular opinion suggests that blood cholesterol is a cause of heart disease, and others, mostly those who deny that animal-based foods, the dietary source of cholesterol, might be a health problem, and mostly in discussion groups on the internet, argue that it is not. Neither is technically correct. Blood cholesterol is only a marker or estimator of disease risk and is most useful when discussing populations of people. For individuals, it is only a crude estimate of disease risk. In 1970, if you were older than 65 years, had a heart attack, and were lucky enough to make it to the hospital alive, you had a 38% chance of dying. Today, if you make it to the hospital alive, you only have a 15% chance of dying. The hospital's emergency response is much better, and consequently, huge numbers of lives are being spared, at least for that moment. In addition, the number of people smoking has steadily been decreasing, which in turn lowers our death rate from heart disease. Our seemingly beneficent mechanical advances in the field of heart disease are severely disappointing. When used for stable disease, bypass surgery, angioplasty, and stents do not address the cause of heart disease, prevent heart attacks, or extend the lives of any but the sickest heart disease patients. Aware that medical, angiographic, and surgical interventions were treating only the symptoms of heart disease and believing that a fundamentally different approach to treatment was necessary, Dr. Esselstyn decided to test the effects of a whole foods, plant-based diet on people with established coronary disease. By using a minimal amount of cholesterol-lowering medication and a very low-fat plant-based diet, he has gotten the most spectacular results ever recorded in the treatment of heart disease. 5 of his patients dropped out of the study within the first 2 years. That left 18. These 18 patients originally had come to Dr. Esselstyn with severe disease. Within the 8 years leading up to the study, these 18 people had suffered through 49 coronary events, including angina, bypass surgery, heart attacks, strokes, and angioplasty. These 18 patients achieved remarkable success. At the start of the study, the patient's average cholesterol level was 246 milligrams per deciliter. During the course of the study, the average cholesterol was 132 milligrams per deciliter, well below the 150 milligrams per deciliter target. Their levels of bad LDL cholesterol dropped just as dramatically. In the end, though, the most impressive result was not the blood cholesterol levels, but how many coronary events occurred since the start of the study. In the following 11 years, there was exactly one coronary event among the 18 patients who followed the diet. That one event was from a patient who strayed from the diet for 2 years. Not only has the disease in these patients been stopped, it has even been reversed. 70% of his patients have seen an opening of their clogged arteries. 11 of his patients had agreed to angiography, a procedure in which specific arteries in the heart can be x-rayed. Of these 11, the blockages in the arteries were, on average, reduced in size by 7% over the first 5 years of his study. This may sound like a small change, but it should be noted that the volume of blood delivered is at least 30% greater when the diameter is increased by 7%. Major cardiac events attributed to progression of disease for this compliant group was less than 1%, one stroke among 177 patients. Among the 21 patients who did not adhere to a whole foods plant-based diet, 62% suffered such events. This finding, less than 1% versus 62%, is truly remarkable, substantially exceeding the findings of any other nutritional intervention. Previous research, it should be noted, has indicated that a 20 to 25% disease recurrence for non-adherence might be more traditional. Dr. Esselstyn has done what big science has been trying to do without success for over 65 years. He defeated heart disease. The patients of Dr. Dean Ornish, who had the best adherence over the course of the year, saw the blockages in their arteries diminish by over 4%. 4% may seem like a small number, but remember that heart disease builds up over a lifetime, so a 4% change in only a year is a fantastic result. In all, 82% of the patients in the experimental group had regression in their heart disease over the course of a year. The healthcare establishment is structured to profit from chemical and surgical intervention. Diet still takes the backseat to drugs and surgery, if it is mentioned to patients at all. If doctors do not believe that patients will change their diets, they will neglect to talk about diet or will do it in an offhand, disparaging way. There is no greater disrespect a doctor can show patients than that of withholding potentially life-saving information based on the assumption that patients do not want to change their lifestyle. While we are told that a total blood cholesterol level of 200 milligrams per deciliter is desirable, we know that 35% of heart attacks strike Americans who have cholesterol levels between 150 and 200 milligrams per deciliter. A truly safe cholesterol level is under 150 milligrams per deciliter. We also know that the most aggressive reversal of heart disease ever demonstrated occurred when fat was about 10% of total calorie intake. Obesity. America has a weight problem. In fact, more than 2 out of 3 adult Americans are at least overweight. 1/3 of the adult population is obese. Not only are these numbers high, but the rate at which they have been rising is ominous. About 18% of 6 to 11-year-olds and 21 of 12 to 19-year-olds in America are overweight. Another 15% are at risk of becoming overweight. Overweight children face a wide range of psychological and social challenges. As you know, children have a knack for being open and blunt. Sometimes the playground can be a merciless place. Overweight children find it more difficult to make friends and are often thought of as lazy and sloppy. They are more likely to have behavioral and learning difficulties, and the low self-esteem likely to be formed during adolescence can last forever. Carrying around too much weight can dramatically affect physical mobility, work, mental health, self-perception, and social life. So you see, this isn't about death. It really is about missing many of the more enjoyable things in life. The solution to losing weight is a whole foods, plant-based diet coupled with a reasonable amount of exercise. It is a long-term lifestyle change rather than a quick fix fad, and it can provide sustained weight loss while minimizing risk of chronic disease. Some people, of course, can be on a plant-based diet and still not lose weight. There are a very few good reasons for this. First and foremost, losing body weight on a plant-based diet is much less likely to occur if the diet includes too many refined carbohydrates. Sweets, pastries, and pastas won't do it. These foods are high in readily digested sugars and starches, and for the pastries, oftentimes very high in fat as well. Throw away ideas about counting calories. Generally speaking, you can eat as much as you want and still lose weight as long as you eat the right type of food. Secondly, stop expecting sacrifice, deprivation, or blandness. There's no need. Feeling hungry is a sign that something is wrong, and prolonged hunger causes your body to slow the overall rate of metabolism in defense. Moreover, there are mechanisms in our bodies that naturally allow the right kind of plant-based foods to nourish us without our having to think about every morsel of food we put in our mouths. It is a worry-free way to eat. Give your body the right food and it will do the right thing. Fruits, vegetables, and grains, as whole foods, are much less energy-dense than animal foods and added fats. There are fewer calories in each spoonful or cupful of these foods. Remember that fat has 9 calories per gram, while carbohydrates and protein have only 4 calories per gram. In addition, whole fruits, vegetables, and grains have a lot of fiber, which makes you feel full and yet contribute relatively small amounts of calories to your meal. So by eating a healthy meal, you may reduce the calories that you consume, digest, and absorb, even if you eat significantly more food. Starting and stopping an exercise program is not a good idea. It is better to build it into your lifestyle so that you will become and continue to be more fit overall, not just burn off calories. A plant-based diet operates on calorie balance to keep body weight under control in 2 ways. First, it discharges calories as body heat instead of storing them as body fat, and it doesn't take many calories to make a big difference over the course of a year. Second, a plant-based diet encourages more physical activity, and as body weight goes down, it becomes easier to be physically active. Diet and exercise work together to decrease body weight and improve overall health. Obesity is not a condition that can be fixed in a few weeks or even a few months, and you should beware of diets, potions, and pills that create rapid weight loss with no promise of good health in the future. The diet that helps to reduce weight in the short run needs to be the same diet that creates and maintains health in the long run. Treating obesity in isolation means ignoring associated diseases that have been shown to arise from the same dietary cause. But while the science may be complex, the practical answer is simple. We can control the cause. It is right at the end of our fork. Diabetes. Almost all cases of diabetes are either type 1 or type 2. Type 1 develops in children and adolescents, and thus is sometimes referred to as juvenile onset diabetes. This form accounts for 5% to 10% of all diabetes cases. Type 2, which accounts for 90 to 95% of all cases, used to occur primarily in adults age 40 and up, and thus was called adult onset diabetes. Type 1 diabetics cannot produce adequate insulin because the insulin-producing cells of their pancreas have been destroyed or are dysfunctional. This is the result of the body attacking itself, making type 1 diabetes an autoimmune disease. Type 2 diabetics can produce insulin, but the insulin doesn't do its job effectively. Once the insulin starts giving orders to dispatch the blood sugar into cells, the body doesn't pay attention and the blood sugar is not metabolized properly. This is called insulin resistance. As carbohydrate intake goes up and fat intake goes down, the number of deaths from diabetes plummets from 20.4 to 2.9 per 100,000 people. The verdict? A high carbohydrate, low-fat diet, a plant-based diet, is unmistakably associated with lower rates of diabetes. In England and Wales, the rate of diabetes markedly dropped from 1940 to 1950, largely during World War II, when food consumption patterns changed markedly. During the war, in its aftermath, fiber and grain intake went up and fat intake went down. People ate lower on the food chain because of national necessity. Around 1950, though, people gave up the grain-based diets and returned to eating more fat, more sugar, and less fiber. Sure enough, diabetes rates started going up. Type 1 diabetics cannot produce insulin. It is difficult to imagine any dietary change that might aid in their predicament. But after just 3 weeks, the type 1 diabetes patients were able to lower their insulin medication by an average of 40%. Their blood sugar profiles improved dramatically. Just as importantly, their cholesterol levels dropped by 30%. Remember, one of the dangers of being diabetic is the secondary outcomes, heart disease and stroke. Lowering risk factors for those secondary outcomes by improving the cholesterol profile is almost as important as treating high blood sugar. Type 2 diabetics, unlike type 1, are more treatable because they haven't incurred such extensive damage to their pancreas. So the results from Anderson's type 2 patients on the high-fiber, low-fat diet were even more impressive. Of the 25 type 2 patients, 24 were able to discontinue their insulin medication. Common cancers: breast, prostate, large bowel, colon and rectal. I have chosen to comment on 3 cancers that affect hundreds or thousands of Americans and that generally represent other cancers as well. 2 reproductive cancers that get plenty of attention, breast and prostate, and 1 digestive cancer, large bowel, the second leading cause of cancer death behind lung cancer. Just because a person has the gene for a disease does not mean that they are destined to get the cancer. Prominent studies reported that only a tiny minority of cancers can be solely blamed on genes. There are at least 4 important breast cancer risk factors that are affected by nutrition. Many of these relationships were confirmed in the China study after being well established in other research. With the exception of blood cholesterol, these risk factors are variations on the same theme: exposure to excess amounts of female hormones, including estrogen and progesterone, increases breast cancer risk. Women who consume a diet rich in animal-based foods with a reduced amount of whole plant-based foods reach puberty earlier and menopause later, thus extending their reproductive lives. They also have higher levels of female hormones throughout their lifespan. According to our China study data, lifetime exposure to estrogen is at least 2.5 to 3 times higher among Western women when compared with rural Chinese women. Understandably, women who are most afraid of this disease have a family history of breast cancer. Family history implies that genes do play a role in the development of breast cancer, but I hear too many people say, in effect, that it's all in the family and deny that they can do anything to help themselves. This fatalistic attitude removes a sense of personal responsibility for one's own health and profoundly limits available options. Drugs such as tamoxifen and its newer analogues are considered anti-estrogen drugs. In effect, they work by reducing the activity of estrogen, which is known to be associated with elevated breast cancer risk. My question is quite simple. Why don't we ask why estrogen is so high in the first place, and once we recognize its nutritional origin, why don't we correct that cause? We now have enough information to show that a diet low in animal-based protein, low in fat, and high in whole plant foods, or reduce estrogen levels. Women at high risk for breast cancer are given 3 options: watch and wait, take tamoxifen medication for the remainder of their lives, or undergo mastectomy. There should be a 4th option: consuming a diet free of animal-based foods, refined carbohydrates, and added fats, avoiding alcohol, which increases breast cancer risk, and enjoying abundant exercise, which significantly decreases risk, in addition to regular monitoring for those at high risk. While exposure to environmental chemicals based on occupation does appear to play some role in cancer development, blaming the relationship between diet and breast cancer on environmental chemicals in our food has long been used to avoid the far more important role of our food's nutrient composition. Upon ingestion, environmental chemicals, like their pharmaceutical relatives, are detoxified, sometimes activated, by a major liver enzyme system called the mixed function oxidase. Nutrition can substantially and quickly modify this enzyme activity, a fact that I have reviewed over 40 years ago. We showed that modest changes in dietary protein, for example, can greatly change the toxicity of a pesticide, like heptachlor, a barbiturate, like phenobarbital, and the carcinogenicity of even the most potent chemical carcinogens, like aflatoxin. Each may be called an environmental chemical. The observed effects of environmental chemicals in these and other studies may primarily be an expression of nutrition's effect on disease outcomes with or without environmental chemical intervention. Instead of relying on hormone replacement therapy, I suggest that there is a better way, using food. The argument goes like this. During the reproductive years, hormone levels are elevated, although the levels among women who eat plant-based diets are not as elevated. When women reach the end of their reproductive years, it is entirely natural for reproductive hormones of all women to drop to a low base level. As reproductive years come to an end, the lower hormone levels among plant eaters don't crash as hard as they do among animal eaters. Using hypothetical numbers for circulating estrogen levels to illustrate the concept, the levels of plant eaters may crash from 40 to 15 rather than 60 to 15 for animal eaters. These abrupt hormone changes in the body are what cause menopausal symptoms. Therefore, a plant-based diet leads to a less severe hormone crash and a gentler menopause. Because colon and rectal cancers are both cancers of the large bowel, and because of their other similarities, they often are grouped together under the term colorectal cancer. It is the 4th most common cancer worldwide in terms of overall mortality. North America, Europe, Australia, and wealthier Asian countries, Japan, Singapore, have very high rates of colorectal cancer, while Africa, Asia, and most of Central and South America have very low rates. For example, the Czech Republic has a death rate of 34.19 per 100,000 males, while Bangladesh has a death rate of 0.63 per 100,000 males. Rates of colorectal cancer change rapidly as a population's diet or lifestyle changes. These rapid changes in cancer rates within one population cannot possibly be explained by changes in inherited genes. In the context of human society, it takes thousands of years to get widespread permanent changes in the inherited genes that are passed from one generation to the next. Countries where more meat, more animal protein, more sugar, and fewer cereal grains were consumed had far higher rates of colon cancer. Another researcher whom I mentioned in Chapter 4, Dennis Burkitt, hypothesized that intake of dietary fiber was essential for digestive health in general. He compared stool samples and fiber intakes in Africa and Europe and proposed that colorectal cancers were largely the result of low fiber intake. Fiber, remember, is only found in plant foods. It is the part of the plant that our body cannot digest. Using data from another famous study that compared diets in 7 different countries, researchers found that eating an additional 10 grams of dietary fiber a day lowered the long-term risk of colon cancer by 33%. Nobody has ever been able to prove that fiber is the magic bullet for preventing colorectal cancer. There are important technical reasons why a definitive conclusion regarding fiber is difficult to make. Each of these reasons is related either directly or indirectly to the fact that dietary fiber is not a single simple substance producing a single simple benefit. Fiber represents hundreds of substances, and its benefits operate through an exceptionally complex series of biochemical and physiological events. Each time researchers assess the consumption of dietary fiber, they must decide which of the hundreds of fiber subfractions to measure and which methods to use. The uncertainty of having a standard procedure prompted us to measure fiber in more than a dozen ways in our China study. As summarized in Chapter 4, as consumption of almost all of these fiber types went up, colon and rectal cancer rates went down. But we could make no clear interpretations as to which type of fiber was especially important. Despite the uncertainties, I continue to believe that Burkitt's initial hypothesis that fiber-containing diets prevent colorectal cancers is correct, and that some of this effect is due to the aggregate effect of all the fiber types. Because carbohydrate confusion persists, let me remind you that there are two different types of carbohydrates, refined and complex. Refined carbohydrates are the starches and the sugars obtained from plants by mechanically stripping off their outer layers, which contain most of the plant's vitamins, minerals, protein, and fiber. This quote-unquote food, regular sugar, white flour, etc., has very little nutritional value. Foods such as pastas made from refined flour, sugary cereals, white bread, candies, and sugar-laden soft drinks should be avoided as much as possible. But do eat whole, complex carbohydrate-containing foods such as unprocessed fresh fruits and vegetables and whole grain products like brown rice and oatmeal. These unprocessed carbohydrates, especially from fruits and vegetables, are exceptionally health-promoting. Even if you have a high genetic risk, a healthy plant-based diet is capable of negating most, if not all, of that risk by controlling the expression of these genes. Because a high-fiber diet can only prevent colon cancer, extra fiber won't ever promote cancer, dietary recommendations should be the same regardless of one's genetic risk. The prostate is a male reproductive organ, about the size of a walnut, located between the bladder and the colon. It is responsible for producing some of the fluid that helps sperm on its quest to fertilize the egg. Prostate cancer is one of the most commonly diagnosed cancers among men in the United States, representing about 25% of all tumors. As many as half of all men 70 years and older have latent prostate cancer, a silent form of the cancer that is not yet causing discomfort. Prostate cancer is not only extremely prevalent, but also slow-growing. Only 7% of diagnosed prostate cancer victims die within 5 years. Prostate cancer rates vary widely between different countries, even more than breast cancer. High prostate cancer rates primarily exist in societies with Western diets and lifestyles. In developing countries, men who adopt Western eating practices or move to Western countries suffer more prostate cancer. Dairy intake is one of the most consistent dietary predictors for prostate cancer in the published literature, and those who consume the most dairy have double to quadruple the risk. This growth hormone, insulin-like growth factor 1, IGF-1, is turning out to be a predictor of cancer just as cholesterol is a predictor for heart disease. Under normal conditions, this hormone efficiently manages the rates at which cells grow, that is, how they reproduce themselves and how they discard old cells, all in the name of good health. Under unhealthy conditions, however, IGF-1 becomes more active, increasing the birth and growth of new cells while simultaneously inhibiting the removal of old cells, both of which favor the development of cancer. Consuming animal-based foods increases the blood levels of this growth hormone, IGF-1. With regard to prostate cancer, people with higher than normal blood levels of IGF-1 have been shown to have 5.1 times the risk of advanced stage prostate cancer. There's more. When men also have low blood levels of a protein that binds and inactivates IGF-1, they will have 9.5 times the risk of advanced stage prostate cancer. Animal protein causes the body to produce more IGF-1, which in turn throws cell growth and removal out of whack, stimulating cancer development. Animal protein suppresses the production of supercharged D. Excessive calcium, as found in milk, also suppresses the production of supercharged D. Supercharged D is responsible for creating a wide variety of health benefits in the body. Persistently low levels of supercharged D create an inviting environment for different cancers, autoimmune diseases, osteoporosis, and other diseases. Autoimmune diseases. The most studied are multiple sclerosis, MS, rheumatoid arthritis, lupus, type 1 diabetes, and rheumatic heart disease. These are also the primary autoimmune diseases that have been studied in reference to diet. Each disease name may sound very different, but as one review points out, it is important to consider these disorders as a group. They show similar clinical backgrounds, they sometimes occur in the same person, and they are often found in the same populations. MS and type 1 diabetes, for example, have nearly identical ethnic and geographic distribution. Autoimmune diseases in general become more common the greater the distance from the equator. This phenomenon has been known since 1922. MS, for example, is over 100 times more prevalent in the far north than at the equator. Because some of these common features, it is not too far-fetched to think of the autoimmune diseases as one grand diseases living in different places in the body and taking on different names. We refer in this way to cancer, which is specifically named depending on what part of the body it resides in. All autoimmune diseases are the result of one group of physiological mechanisms gone awry, much like cancer. In this case, the mechanism is the immune system mistakenly attacking cells in its own body. Whether it is the pancreas, as in type 1 diabetes, the myelin sheath, as in MS, or joint tissues, as in arthritis, all autoimmune diseases involve an immune system that has revolted. Foreign invaders are protein molecules called antigens. These foreign cells can be a bacterium or a virus looking to corrupt the body's integrity. So when our immune system notices these antigens, it destroys them. Each of these foreign antigens has a separate identity, which is determined by the sequence of amino acids that comprises its proteins. To counter these antigens, our immune system must customize its defense to each attack. It does this by creating a mirror image protein for each attacker. The mirror image is able to fit perfectly onto the antigen and destroy it. Remembering each defense against each invader is what immunization is all about. An initial exposure to chickenpox, for example, is a difficult battle, but the second time your immune system encounters that virus, it will know exactly how to deal with it, and the war will be shorter, less painful, and much more successful. You may not even get sick. The immune system molds that fit these invaders also fit our own cells. The immune system then destroys, under some circumstances, everything that fits the mold, including our own cells. This is an extremely complex, self-destructive process involving many different strategies on the part of the immune system, all of which share the same fatal flaw of not being able to distinguish foreign invader proteins from the proteins of our own body. The antigens that trick our bodies into attacking our own cells may be in food. During the process of digestion, for example, some proteins slip into our bloodstream from the intestine without being fully broken down into their amino acid parts. The remnants of undigested proteins are treated as foreign invaders by our immune system, which sets about making molds to destroy them and launches the self-destructive autoimmune process. One of the foods that supplies many of the foreign proteins that mimic our own body proteins is cow's milk. Even though an invading antigen looks just like one of the cells in our own body, the system can still distinguish our own cells from the invading antigen. In fact, the immune system may use our own cells to practice making molds against the invader antigen without actually destroying the friendly cell. The ability of cow's milk protein to initiate type 1 diabetes is well documented. And the possible initiation of this disease goes like this. A baby is not nourished long enough and is fed cow's milk protein, perhaps in an infant formula. The milk reaches the small intestine, where it is digested down to its amino acid parts. For some infants, cow's milk is not fully digested and small amino acid chains or fragments of the original protein remain in the intestine. These incompletely digested protein fragments may be absorbed into the blood. The immune system recognizes these fragments as foreign invaders and goes about destroying them. Unfortunately, some of the fragments look exactly the same as the cells of the pancreas that are responsible for making insulin. The immune system loses its ability to distinguish between the cow's milk protein fragments and the pancreatic cells and destroys them both, hereby eliminating the child's ability to produce insulin. The infant becomes a type 1 diabetic and remains so for the rest of his or her life. Of the 142 diabetic children measured, every single one had antibody levels higher than 3.55 IgG, immunoglobulin G. Of the 79 normal children, every single one had antibody levels less than 3.55. In other words, there was no overlap in levels between diabetic and normal children. All of the diabetic children had levels of cow's milk antibodies that were higher than those of all the non-diabetic children. This implies two things. Children with more antibodies consumed more cow's milk, and increased antibodies may cause type 1 diabetes. A study in Chile considered the first two factors, cow's milk and genes. Genetically susceptible children weaned too early onto cow's milk-based formula had a risk of type 1 diabetes that was 13.1 times greater than children who did not have these genes and who were breastfed for at least 3 months, thus minimizing their exposure to cow's milk. Another study in the US showed that genetically susceptible children fed cow's milk as infants had a risk of disease that was 11.3 times greater than children who did not have these genes and who were breastfed for at least 3 months. To put this in perspective, smokers have approximately 10 times greater risk of getting lung cancer, still less than the 11 to 13 times risk here. And people with high blood pressure and cholesterol have a 2.5 to 3 times greater risk of heart disease. The greater the consumption of cow's milk, the greater the prevalence of type 1 diabetes. In Finland, type 1 diabetes is 36 times more common than in Japan. Large amounts of cow's milk products are consumed in Finland, but very little is consumed in Japan. Multiple sclerosis, MS, is a particularly difficult autoimmune disease, both for those who have it and for those who care for its victims. It is a lifelong battle involving a variety of unpredictable and serious disabilities. MS patients often pass through episodes of acute attacks while gradually losing their ability to walk or to see. After 10 to 15 years, they often are confined to a wheelchair and then to a bed for the rest of their lives. The multiple symptoms of this disease represent a nervous system gone awry. In MS patients, the electrical signals carrying messages to and from the central nervous system, brain and spinal cord, and out through the peripheral nervous system to the rest of the body are not well coordinated and controlled. This is because the insulating cover or sheath of the nerve fibers, the myelin, is being destroyed by an autoimmune reaction. Think of what would happen to your household wiring if the electrical insulation became thin or was stripped away, leaving bare wires. The electrical signals would be short-circuited. That is what happens with MS. The wayward electrical signals may destroy cells and burn patches of neighboring tissue, leaving little scars or bits of sclerotic tissue. These burns can become serious and ultimately destroy the body. Dr. Swank found that progression of disease was greatly reduced by the low saturated fat diet, which worked even for people with initially advanced conditions. He summarized his work in 1990, concluding that for the subgroup of patients who began the low saturated fat diet during the earlier stages of their disease, about 95% remained only mildly disabled for approximately 30 years. Only 5% of these patients died. In contrast, 80% of the patients with early-stage MS who consumed the poor diet, higher saturated fat, died of MS. Just as we hypothesized that diseases of affluence, such as cancer and heart disease, have common causes because they share similar geography and similar biochemical biomarkers, we can also hypothesize that MS, type 1 diabetes, rheumatoid arthritis, lupus, and other autoimmune diseases may share a similar cause if they exhibit similar characteristics. First, by definition, each of these diseases involves an immune system that has gone awry in such a way that it attacks self-proteins that look the same as foreign proteins. Second, all the autoimmune diseases that have been studied have been found to be more common at the higher geographic latitudes where there is less constant sunshine. Third, some of these diseases have a tendency to afflict the same people. MS and type 1 diabetes, for example, have been shown to coexist in the same individuals. Fourth, of those diseases studied in relation to nutrition, the consumption of animal-based foods, especially cow's milk, is associated with greater disease risk. Fifth, there is evidence that a virus or viruses may trigger the onset of several of these diseases. A sixth and most important characteristic binding together these diseases is the evidence that their mechanisms of action, jargon used to describe the how-to of disease formation, have much in common. As we consider common mechanisms of action, we might start with sunlight exposure, because this somehow seems linked to the autoimmune diseases. Sunlight exposure, which decreases with increasing latitude, could be important, but clearly there are other factors. The consumption of animal-based foods, especially cow's milk, also increases with distance from the equator. There are experimental animal models of lupus, MS, rheumatoid arthritis, and inflammatory bowel disease, e.g. Crohn's disease, ulcerative colitis, each of which is an autoimmune disease. Vitamin D, operating through a similar mechanism in each case, prevents the experimental development of each of these diseases. The first step in the vitamin D process occurs when you go outside on a sunny day. When the sunshine hits your exposed skin, the skin produces vitamin D. The vitamin D then must be activated in the kidney in order to produce a form that helps repress the development of autoimmune diseases. As we've seen before, this critically important activation step can be inhibited by foods that are high in calcium and by acid-producing animal proteins like cow's milk. Some grains also produce excess acid. Wide-ranging effects: bone, kidney, eye, and brain diseases. What has become so convincing about the effect of a diet on health is the breadth of the evidence. While a single study might be found to support almost any idea under the sun, what are the chances that hundreds, even thousands of different studies show a protective benefit of plant-based foods and or harmful effects of animal-based foods for so many different diseases? We can't say it's due to coincidence, bad data, biased research, misinterpreted statistics, or playing with the numbers. This has got to be the real deal. I will cover 5 more seemingly unrelated diseases common in America: osteoporosis, kidney stones, blindness, cognitive dysfunction, and Alzheimer's disease. These disorders are not often fatal and are frequently regarded as the inevitable consequences of aging. Americans consume more cow's milk and its products per person than most populations in the world. So Americans should have wonderfully strong bones, right? Unfortunately not. A recent study showed that American women aged 50 and older have one of the highest rates of hip fractures in the world. The only countries with higher rates are in Europe and in the South Pacific, Australia and New Zealand, where they consume even more milk than the United States. The report summarized data on protein intake and fracture rates taken from 34 separate surveys in 16 countries that were published in 29 peer-reviewed research publications. All the subjects in these surveys were women 50 years and older. It found that a very impressive 70% of the fracture rate was attributable to the consumption of animal protein. These researchers explained that animal protein, unlike plant protein, increases the acid load on the body. An increased acid load means that our blood and tissues become more acidic. The body does not like this acidic environment and begins to fight it. In order to neutralize the acid, the body uses calcium, which acts as a very effective base. This calcium, however, must come from somewhere. It ends up being pulled from the bones, and the calcium loss weakens them, putting them at greater risk for fracture. In our rural China study, where the animal-to-plant ratio was about 10%, the fracture rate is only about 1/5 of the US. Nigeria shows an animal-to-plant protein ratio only about 10% that of Germany, and the hip fracture incidence is lower by over 99%. Excessively high calcium intake over a long time impaired the body's ability to control how much calcium it uses and when. Under healthy conditions, the body uses an activated form of vitamin D, calcitriol, to adjust how much calcium it absorbs from food and how much it excretes and distributes to the bone. Calcitriol is considered a hormone. When more calcium is needed, it enhances calcium absorption and restricts calcium excretion. If too much calcium is consumed over a long period of time, the body may lose its ability to regulate calcitriol, permanently or temporarily disrupting the regulation of calcium absorption and excretion. It seems perfectly plausible that animal protein and even calcium, when consumed at excessive levels, are capable of increasing the risk of osteoporosis. Dairy, unfortunately, is the only food that is rich in both of these nutrients. Acute renal colic deserves some explanation. This agonizing symptom is the result of a crystallized stone trying to pass through the thin tube in your body, ureter, that transports urine from the kidney to the bladder. In describing the pain involved, the website states, quote, "This is probably one of the worst pains humans experience. Those who have had it will never forget it. The severe pain of renal colic needs to be controlled by potent painkillers. Don't expect an aspirin to do the trick. Get yourself to a doctor or an emergency room," unquote. The majority involve stones made of calcium and oxalate. These calcium oxalate stones are relatively common in developed countries and relatively rare in developing countries. When enough animal protein-containing foods are consumed, the concentrations of calcium and oxalate in the urine increase sharply, usually within hours. Research also shows that kidney stone formation can be initiated by the activity of free radicals and may thus be prevented by consumption of antioxidant-containing plant-based foods. Increasing fluid intake, i.e. water, helps to reduce kidney stone formation. Macular degeneration is the leading cause of irreversible blindness among people over age 65. Over 1.6 million Americans suffer from this disease, many of whom become blind. As the name implies, this condition involves destruction of the macula, which is the biochemical intersection in the eye, where the energy of the light coming in is transformed into a nerve signal. Around the macula, there are fatty acids, and that can react with incoming light to produce a low level of highly reactive free radicals. These free radicals can destroy or degenerate neighboring tissue, including the macula. But fortunately for us, free radical damage can be repressed thanks to the antioxidants in vegetables and fruits. Macular degeneration risk could be reduced by as much as 88% simply by eating the right foods. Eating antioxidant-containing foods, especially those containing the carotenoids, may prevent macular degeneration. Cataract formation involves the clouding of the eye lens. Corrective surgery involves removing the cloudy lens and replacing it with an artificial lens. The development of the opaque condition, like the degeneration of the macula and so many other disease conditions in your body, is closely associated with the damage created by an excess of reactive free radicals. These two eye conditions, macular degeneration and cataracts, both occur when we fail to consume enough of the highly colored green and leafy vegetables. In both cases, excess free radicals increased by animal-based foods and decreased by plant-based foods are likely to be responsible for these conditions. There is now good dietary information for the two chief conditions referring to mental decline. On the modest side, there is a condition called cognitive impairment or cognitive dysfunction. This condition describes the declining ability to remember and think as well as one once was able to. It represents a continuum of disease ranging from cases that only hint at declining abilities to those that are much more obvious and easily diagnosed. Then there are mental dysfunctions that become serious, even life-threatening. These are called dementia, of which there are two main types, vascular dementia and Alzheimer's disease. Vascular dementia is primarily caused by multiple little strokes resulting from broken blood vessels in the brain. It is common for elderly people to have tiny, silent strokes in their later years. A stroke is considered silent if it goes undetected and undiagnosed. Each little stroke incapacitates part of the brain. The other type of dementia, Alzheimer's, occurs when a protein substance called beta-amyloid accumulates in critical areas of the brain as a plaque, rather like the cholesterol-laden plaque that builds up in cardiovascular diseases. Not only does cognitive impairment often lead to more serious dementia, it is also associated with cardiovascular disease, stroke, and adult-onset type 2 diabetes. All of these diseases cluster in the same populations, oftentimes in the same people. This clustering means that they share some of the same risk factors. Hypertension, high blood pressure, is one factor. Another is high blood cholesterol. Both of these, of course, can be controlled by diet. A third risk factor is the amount of those nasty free radicals, which wreak havoc on brain function in our later years. Scores on mental tests were higher among those people who consumed the most vitamin C and beta-carotene. Other studies have also found that a low level of vitamin C in the blood is linked to poorer cognitive performance in old age, and some have found that B vitamins, including beta-carotene, are linked to better cognitive function. The 7 studies mentioned above all show that one or more nutrients found almost exclusively in plants are associated with a lower risk of cognitive decline in old age. No study has ever found that consuming more dietary antioxidants increases memory loss. When associations are observed, it is always the other way around. The dementia that is caused by the same vascular problems that lead to stroke is clearly affected by diet. In a publication from the famous Framingham study, researchers conclude that for every 3 additional servings of fruits and vegetables a day, the risk of stroke will be reduced by 22%. The men in this study who consumed the most fruits and vegetables consumed as many as 19 servings a day. If every 3 servings lower the risk by 22%, the benefits can add up fast. Risk reduction approaches, but cannot exceed 100%. A study of more than 5,000 people found that greater dietary fat and cholesterol intake tended to increase the risk of Alzheimer's disease specifically, and all dementia in general. Part 3. The Good Nutrition Guide. Very little of the nutrition information that makes it to the public consciousness is soundly based in science, and we pay a grave price. One day olive oil is terrible, the next it is heart healthy. One day eggs will clog your arteries, the next they are a good source of protein. One day potatoes and rice are great, the next they are the gravest threats to your weight you will ever face. Eating right. 8 Principles of Food and Health. We want you to know that based on the information presented in this book, you can increase the odds that you will live longer, look and feel younger, have more energy, lose weight, lower your blood cholesterol, prevent and even reverse heart disease, lower your risk of prostate, breast and other cancers, preserve your eyesight in your later years, prevent and treat diabetes, avoid surgery in many instances, vastly decrease the need for pharmaceutical drugs, keep your bones strong, avoid impotence, avoid stroke, prevent kidney stones, keep your baby from getting type 1 diabetes, alleviate constipation, lower your blood pressure, avoid Alzheimer's, beat arthritis. These are only some of the benefits, and all of them can be yours. The price? Simply changing your diet. Principle number 1. Nutrition represents the combined activities of countless food substances. The whole is greater than the sum of its parts. Our bodies have evolved with this infinitely complex network of reactions in order to derive maximal benefit from whole foods as they appear in nature. The misguided may trumpet the virtues of one specific nutrient or chemical, but this thinking is too simplistic. Our bodies have learned how to benefit from the chemicals in food as they are packaged together, discarding some and using others as they see fit. Principle number 2. Dietary supplements are not a panacea for good health. Because nutrition operates as an infinitely complex biochemical system involving thousands of chemicals and thousands of effects on your health, it makes little or no sense that isolated nutrients taken as supplements can substitute for whole foods. Supplements will not lead to long-lasting health and may cause unforeseen side effects. Furthermore, for those relying on supplements, beneficial and sustained diet change is postponed. In the decades since this book was first published, the main science-based findings have agreed. Supplements are overrated, with little or no redeeming value. It is not that all these nutrients aren't important, they are, but only when consumed as food, not as supplements. Isolating nutrients and trying to get benefits equal to those of whole foods reveals an ignorance of how nutrition operates in the body. Relying on the use of isolated nutrient supplements to maintain health while consuming the usual Western diet is not only a waste of money, but it is also potentially dangerous. There are, however, 2 possible exceptions to this. The first is vitamin B12. Many clinicians have been advocating regular vitamin B12 for individuals consuming the whole foods plant-based diet, which does not contain this vitamin. The second possible exception is vitamin D, though a similar incomplete story exists here. Vitamin D is not a vitamin. It is not a nutrient that we need to consume. Instead, it is a hormone. Our bodies can make it when we get enough sunlight exposure. There are still cases of rickets and osteomalacia, softening of the bones, in which vitamin D deficiency is so great that bone growth and maintenance becomes dysfunctional in North America. This illustrates that for at least a small number of people, the consequences of vitamin D deficiency are very real. Principle number 3. There are virtually no nutrients in animal-based foods that are not better provided by plants. Plant foods have dramatically more antioxidants, fiber, vitamins, and minerals than animal foods. In fact, animal foods are almost completely devoid of several of these nutrients, but they have much more cholesterol and fat. They also have slightly more protein than plant foods, along with more B12 and vitamin D, although the vitamin D is largely added to milk. By definition, for a food chemical to be an essential nutrient, it must meet two requirements. The chemical is necessary for healthy human functioning. The chemical must be something our bodies cannot make on their own, and therefore must be obtained from an outside source. There are 4 quote-unquote nutrients that animal-based foods have that plant-based foods for the most part do not: cholesterol and vitamins A, D, and B12. 3 of these are non-essential nutrients. Cholesterol our bodies make naturally. Vitamin A our bodies can readily make from beta-carotene, and vitamin D we produce simply by exposing our skin to about 15 minutes of sunshine every couple of days. Both of these vitamins are toxic if they are consumed in high amounts. This is one more indication that it is better to rely on the vitamin precursors, beta-carotene and sunshine, so that our bodies can readily control the timing and quantities of vitamin A and D that are needed. As discussed in principle number 2, vitamin B12 is more problematic. Vitamin B12 is made by microorganisms found in soil and the intestines of animals, including our own. The amount made in our intestines is not adequately absorbed, so it is recommended that we consume B12 in food. Research has shown that plants grown in healthy soil that has a good concentration of vitamin B12 will absorb this nutrient. However, in the United States, plants are not a reliable source of B12. Principle number 4. Genes do not determine disease on their own. Genes function only by being activated or expressed, and nutrition plays a critical role in determining which genes, good and bad, are expressed. Not all genes are fully expressed all the time. If they aren't expressed, they remain biochemically dormant. Dormant genes do not have any effect on our health. While we can say that genes are crucial to every biological process, we have some very convincing evidence that gene expression is far more important, and gene expression is controlled by environment, especially nutrition. Expression of our genetic code represents a universe of biochemical interactions of almost infinite complexity. This biochemical universe interacts with many different systems, including nutrition, which itself represents whole systems of complex biochemistry. With genetic research, we suspect we are embarking on a massive quest to shortcut nature, only to end up worse off than when we started. Principle number 5. Nutrition can substantially control the adverse effects of noxious chemicals. There is a widely held perception that cancer is caused by toxic chemicals that make their way into our bodies in a sinister way. For example, people often cite health concerns to justify their opposition to pumping antibiotics and hormones into farm animals. The assumption is that the meat would be safe to eat if it didn't have all those unnatural chemicals in it. The real danger of the meat, however, is the nutrient imbalances, regardless of the presence or absence of those nasty chemicals. Long before modern chemicals were introduced into our food, people still began to experience more cancer and more heart disease when they started to eat more animal-based foods. We saw that the potential effects of aflatoxin, a chemical touted as being highly carcinogenic, could be entirely controlled by nutrition. Even with large doses of aflatoxin, rats could be healthy, active, and cancer-free if they were fat, low-protein diets. Principle number 6. The same nutrition that prevents disease in its early stages, before diagnosis, can also halt or reverse disease in its later stages, after diagnosis. Chronic diseases take several years to develop. For example, it is generally thought that breast cancer can be initiated in adolescence and not become detectable until after menopause. So we very well may have lots of middle-aged women walking around with breast cancer initiated during their teens that will not be detectable until after menopause. We have seen research findings showing that a whole foods plant-based diet reverses advanced heart disease, helps obese people lose weight, and helps diabetics get off their medication and return to a more normal pre-diabetes life. Research has also shown that early-stage prostate cancer may be attenuated or reversed by lifestyle changes. Some diseases, of course, appear to be irreversible. The autoimmune diseases are perhaps the most frightening because once the body turns against itself, they may become unstoppable. And yet, amazingly, even some of these diseases may be slowed or attenuated by diet. Principle number 7. Nutrition that is truly beneficial for one chronic disease will support health across the board. As I've come to understand more about the biochemical processes of various diseases, I have also come to see how these diseases have much in common. Because of these impressive commonalities, it only makes sense that the same good nutrition will generate health and prevent diseases across the board. Even if a whole foods plant-based diet is more effective at treating heart disease than brain cancer, you can be sure that this diet will not promote one disease while it stops another. It will never be bad for you. This one good diet can only help across the board. Principle number 8. Good nutrition creates health in all areas of our existence. All parts are interconnected. Conceptually, Tom and I believe in holistic health, but not as a catchphrase for every unconventional and oftentimes unproven medicine around. Food and nutrition, for example, are of primary importance to our health. The process of eating is perhaps the most intimate encounter we have with our world. What we eat becomes part of our body. But other experiences are important, such as physical activity, emotional and mental health, and the well-being of our environment. Incorporating these various spheres into our concept of health is important because they are all interconnected. Indeed, this is a holistic concept. The evidence regarding increased energy levels has been supported by an enormous amount of anecdotal evidence I've encountered over the years. People have more energy when they eat well. Physical activity has an effect on emotional and mental well-being. Much has been said about the effect physical activity has on various chemicals in our bodies, which in turn affects our moods and our concentration. And experiencing the rewards of feeling better emotionally and being more mentally alert provides the confidence and motivation to treat ourselves to optimal nutrition, which reinforces the entire cycle. Those who feel good about themselves are more likely to respect their health by practicing good nutrition. Sometimes people try to play these different parts of their lives against each other. People wonder if they can erase bad eating habits by being a runner. The answer to this is no. The benefits and risks of diet are crucially important and more sizable than the benefits and risks of other activities. If we eat the way that promotes the best health for ourselves, we promote the best health for the planet. By eating a whole foods plant-based diet, we use less water, less land, and fewer resources, produce less pollution, and inflict less suffering on our farm animals. The applicability of these principles should not be underestimated. Most importantly, they can help to reduce public confusion regarding food and health. The latest fads, the newest headlines, and the most recent study results are put into useful context. We need not leap from our seats every time a chemical is called a carcinogen, every time a new diet book hits the shelf, or every time a headline screams about solving disease through genetic research. Simply put, we can relax. How to eat. Good food and good health is simple. The biology of the relationship of food and health is exceptionally complex, but the message is still simple. The recommendations coming from the published literature are so simple that we can state them in one sentence. Eat a whole foods plant-based diet while minimizing the consumption of refined foods, added salt, and added fats. Daily supplements of vitamin B12 and perhaps vitamin D for people who spend most of their time indoors and or live in the northern climates are encouraged. The findings from the China study indicate that the lower the percentage of animal-based foods that are consumed, the greater the health benefits, even when that percentage declines from 10% to 0% of calories. So it's not unreasonable to assume that the optimum percentage of animal-based products is 0, at least for anyone with a predisposition for a degenerative disease. But this has not been absolutely proven. It is true that most of the health benefits described in this book have been realized at low but non-zero levels of animal-based foods. My advice is to try to eliminate all animal-based products from your diet, but not obsess over it. There are 3 excellent reasons to go all the way. First, following this diet requires a radical shift in your thinking about food. It's more work to just do it halfway. If you plan for animal-based products, you'll eat them, and you'll almost certainly eat more than you should. Second, you'll feel deprived. Instead of viewing your new food habit as being able to eat all the plant-based food you want, you'll be seeing it in terms of having to limit yourself, which is not conducive to staying on the diet long term. And third, you will, within a month or so, perhaps a little more, actually break the physiological addiction that we acquire from eating large amounts of fat and refined carbohydrates. If you are one of these people, if you are curious about these findings but know in your heart that you will never be able to give up meat, then no amount of talk will ever convince you to change your mind. You have to try it and see it for yourself. Give it 1 month. You've been eating cheeseburgers your whole life. A month without them won't kill you. A month isn't enough time to give you any long-term benefits, but it is long enough for you to discover 4 things. 1. There are some great foods you can eat in a plant-based diet that you otherwise may never have discovered. 2. It's not all that bad. Some people take to this diet quite quickly and love it. Many take months to fully adjust to it, at which point they often discover some new tastes. But almost everyone will find that it's a lot easier than they thought. 3. You'll feel better. Even after only a month, most people will feel better and likely lose some weight too. 4. Most important, you'll discover that it's possible. You may love the diet or you may not, but at the very least you'll come away from your 1 week or 1 month trial knowing that it's possible. You can do it if you choose to. You'll notice we use the phrase eating a whole food plant-based diet rather than vegan or vegetarian. We intentionally do not use these words. Most people who choose to become a vegetarian or vegan have done so for ideological reasons. Although this reason is entirely satisfactory, the diet that results may be limited in nutrient composition. We believe that the health value of a diet is best indicated by the relative amount of fat, protein, and carbohydrate it contains, and that the optimal diet gets approximately 10% of calories from fat, 10% from protein, and 80% from total carbohydrate. For many people, it's actually harder to embrace moderate changes. It's harder to try to limit yourself to just 1 bite of a cookie in the break room now and then than not to have any cookies at all. It's a losing strategy and demands more willpower. Moderation means something different to each person and allows the power of rationalization to creep in and keep you from your goals. Part 4. Why haven't you heard this before? We believe it is essential to know how information is created and how it reaches the public consciousness. As you will come to see, much is governed by the golden rule. He who has the gold makes the rules. There are powerful, influential, and enormously wealthy industries that stand to lose a vast amount of money if Americans start shifting to a plant-based diet. The powerful interests that maintain the status quo do not usually conduct illegal business. As far as we know, they do not pay scientists to cook the data. They do not bribe elected officials or make sordid, underhanded deals. The situation is much worse. The entire system, government, science, medicine, industry, media, and academia, promotes profits over health, technology over food, and confusion over clarity. Most but not all of the confusion about nutrition is created in legal, fully disclosed ways, and is disseminated by unsuspecting, well-intentioned people, whether they are researchers, politicians, or journalists. I have spent a lifetime assuming, somewhat naively, that those of us who spend public money had a shared mission to serve the public, or so we proudly said. I was wrong. Professional societies to which I belong or have belonged have become even more entrenched in their state, comfortable, worn-out missions. Even members of the academic institution that I served for so long, Cornell University, have made clear their objections to the path I've taken. Certain administrators have done everything they can to sidetrack or discredit this message. Poor personal health, destructive healthcare costs, environmental degradation, political corruption. Make no mistake, these problems are massive. If they are not resolved, they will, no doubt, destroy our society and our planet with it. But they can be solved, and we have sufficient evidence not only that nutrition can do so, but also that it can do so far more effectively than any other means available to us. Science, the dark side. Very few experiences are as personal and as powerful as those of people who have lost their health prematurely. Understandably, they are willing to believe and try just about anything that might help. They are a highly vulnerable group of consumers. After being denied control of this promising new report on diet, nutrition, and cancer, the pro-industry Food and Nutrition Board needed to do some damage control. An alternate group was quickly established, the new Public Nutrition Information Committee. Who were its leaders? Bob Olson, Alfred Harper, and Tom Jukes, a longtime industry scientist, each of whom held a university faculty position. I was initially innocent of the group's purpose, but by our first meeting in the spring of 1980, I had discovered that of the 18 members on that committee, I was the only individual who did not have ties to the commercial world of food and drug companies and their coalitions. This committee was a stacked deck. Its members were entrenched in the status quo. Their professional associations, their friends, the people they fraternized with, were all pro-industry. They enjoyed the meaty American diet themselves and were unwilling to consider the possibility that their views were wrong. In addition, some of them enjoyed handsome benefits, including first-class travel expenses and nice consulting fees paid by animal foods companies. Although there was nothing illegal about any of these activities, it certainly laid bare a serious conflict of interest that put most of the committee members at odds with the public interest. This is analogous to the situation as it unfolded surrounding cigarettes and health. When scientific evidence first emerged to show that cigarettes were dangerous, hordes of health professionals vigorously defended smoking. For example, the Journal of the American Medical Association continued to advertise tobacco products, and many doctors played their part staunchly, defending tobacco use. In many cases, these scientists were motivated by understandable caution. But there were quite a few others, particularly as the evidence against tobacco mounted, whose motivations were clearly personal bias and greed. A couple of weeks later, back in upstate New York, I turned on a morning TV news show and Tom Brokaw appeared on the screen and started talking about nutrition with Bob Olson, of all people. They were discussing a recent report that Olson and friends had produced at the National Academy of Sciences, NAS, called Toward Healthful Diets. This report, which was one of the briefest, most superficial reports on health ever produced by the NAS, extolled the virtues of the high-fat, high-meat American diet, and basically confirmed that all was well with how America was eating. From a scientific point of view, the message was a doozy. I remember one exchange where Tom Brokaw asked about fast food, and Olson confidently stated that McDonald's hamburgers were fine. With millions of viewers watching, this quote-unquote expert praise the health value of McDonald's hamburgers, it's no wonder that consumers around the country were confused. Only a handful of insiders could possibly know that his views did not even come close to reflecting the best understanding of the science at the time. In the world of nutrition and health, scientists are not free to pursue their research wherever it leads. Coming to the quote-unquote wrong conclusions, even through first-rate science, can damage your career. Trying to disseminate those wrong conclusions to the public for the sake of public health can destroy your career. Mine was not destroyed. I was lucky and some good people stood up for me, but it could have gone much worse. The personal experiences I have talked about in this chapter, only a sample of such experiences, have consequences far greater than personal aggravation and damage to my career. They illustrate the dark side of science, the side that harms not just individual researchers who get in the way, but all of society. It does this by systematically attempting to conceal, defeat, and destroy viewpoints that oppose the status quo. There are some people in very influential government and university positions who operate under the guise of being scientific quote-unquote experts, whose real jobs are to stifle open and honest scientific debate. Perhaps they receive significant personal compensation for attending to the interests of powerful food and drug companies, or perhaps they merely have an honest personal bias towards a company-friendly viewpoint. Personal bias is stronger than you may think. I know scientists with family members who died from cancer, and it angers them to entertain the possibility that personal choices, like diet, could have played a role in the death of their loved ones. Likewise, there are scientists for whom the high-fat, mostly plant-based diet they eat every day is simply what they learned was healthy at a young age. They love the habit and they don't want to change. The vast majority of scientists are honorable, intelligent, and dedicated to the search for the common good rather than personal gain. However, a few are willing to sell their souls to the highest bidder. They may not be many in number, but their influence can be vast. They can corrupt the good name of institutions of which they are part of, and most importantly, they can create vast confusion among the public, which often cannot know who is who. Institutions are also part of the dark side of science. Committees like the PNIC and the American Council on Science and Health generate intellectually lopsided panels, committees, and institutions that are far more interested in promoting their point of view than in debating scientific research with an open mind. Only someone familiar with the inside of the system can distinguish between sincere positions based in science and insincere, self-serving positions. I was on the inside for many years, working at the very top levels, and saw enough to be able to say that science is not always the honest search for truth that so many believe it to be. It far too often involves money, power, ego, and protection of personal interests above the common good. Very few, if any, illegal acts need to occur. Scientific reductionism. In the report summary, we recommended getting these nutrients from foods, not pills or supplements. We explicitly stated that, quote, these recommendations apply only to foods as sources of nutrients, not to dietary supplements of individual nutrients, unquote. The report quickly found its way to the corporate world, which saw a major money-making opportunity. They ignored our cautionary message distinguishing foods from pills and began advertising vitamin pills as products that could prevent cancer, arrogantly citing our report as justification. This was a great opening to a vast new market, commercial vitamin supplements. The focus on individual nutrients instead of whole foods has become commonplace in the past 3 decades. The nutrient that our committee focused on the most was fat. The first guideline in the report explicitly stated that high fat consumption is linked to cancer and recommended reducing our fat intake from 40% to 30% of calories, although this goal of 30% was an arbitrary cutoff point. If we went below 30%, consumers would be required to reduce animal food intake, and that would be the death of the report. At the time of this report, all of the human-based studies showing fat to be related to cancer, mostly breast and large bowel, were actually showing that the populations with more cancer consumed not just more fat, but also more animal-based foods and fewer plant-based foods. This meant that these cancers could just as easily be caused by animal protein, dietary cholesterol, something else exclusively found in animal-based foods, or a lack of plant-based foods. But rather than wagging the finger at animal-based foods in the studies, dietary fat was given the main culprit. This mistake of characterizing whole foods by the health effects of specific nutrients is what I call reductionism. For example, the health effect of a hamburger cannot be simply attributed to the effect of a few grams of saturated fat in the meat. Saturated fat is merely one ingredient. The health-conscious home has managed to create a meal that is much lower in fat than the average American dinner, but they've done it without adjusting their proportionate intake of animal and plant-based foods. Both meals are centered on animal-based foods. In fact, the low-fat meal actually has more animal-based foods than the high-fat meal. In effect, this is how the nurses in the Nurses' Health Study achieved such a wide variation in fat intake. Some nurses simply are more diligent about choosing low-fat animal products. Many people would consider the low-fat meal to be a triumph of healthy meal planning. But what about the other nutrients in these meals? What about protein and cholesterol? As it turns out, the low-fat meal contains more than double the protein of the high-fat meal, and almost all of it comes from animal-based foods. In addition, the low-fat meal contains almost twice as much cholesterol. When women in America, such as those in the Nurses' Health Study and the billion-dollar Women's Health Trial, reduce their fat intake, they do not do it by reducing their consumption of animal-based foods. Instead, they lose low-fat and non-fat animal products, along with less fat during cooking and at the table. Thus, they are not adopting the diets that were shown in the international correlation studies and in our rural China study to be associated with low breast cancer rates. If one kind of animal-based food is substituted for another, then the adverse health effects of both foods, when compared to plant-based food, are easily missed. To make matters worse, these studies often focused on the consumption of just one nutrient, such as fat. Because of these very serious flaws, these studies have been a virtual disaster for discovering the really significant effects of diet on these diseases. This problem of studying a population that uniformly consumes a high-risk diet and looking at the differences in consumption one nutrient at a time is not unique to the Nurses' Health Study. It is common to virtually all studies using Western subjects. I strongly reject the implications in Willett's argument that specific components of the diet can be modified to the benefit of one's health. This is precisely what is wrong with this area of research. In fact, if the Nurses' Health Study shows nothing else, it demonstrates that modifying the intake of one nutrient at a time without questioning whole dietary patterns does not confer significant health benefits. Women who tinker with fat while maintaining a near carnivorous diet do not have a lower breast cancer risk. This gets to the heart of reductionism in science. As long as scientists study highly isolated chemicals and food components and take the information out of context to make sweeping assumptions about complex diet and disease relationships, confusion will result. On occasion, when our paths have crossed, Professor Willett and I have had discussions about the findings on fat as they relate to the China study and the Nurses' Health Study. I have always made the same point. Whole foods, plant-based diets, naturally low in fat, are not included in the Nurses' Health Study cohort, and that it is these types of diets that are the most beneficial for our health. Professor Willett has said to me in response on more than one occasion, "You may be right, Colin, but people don't want to go there." This comment has disturbing implications. Scientists should not be ignoring ideas just because we perceive that the public does not want to hear them. The science of industry. We're all customers of hunger and death, so there's a lot of money to be spent and made. Because of this, the food and health industries in America are among the most influential organizations in the world. The revenue they generate is staggering. Many individual food companies have over $10 billion in annual revenues. These food companies and associations use whatever methods they can to enhance their product's appeal and grow their market. One way to accomplish this is to claim nutritional benefits for the food products they sell. At the same time, these companies and associations must protect their products from being considered unhealthy. If a product is linked to cancer or some other disease, profits and revenue will evaporate. Food business interests need to claim that their product is good for you, or at least that it's not bad for you. In this process, the quote-unquote science of nutrition becomes the business of marketing. In 1995, two major milk industry groups put a new face on their old establishment, renaming it Dairy Management Incorporated. The purpose of this new group was to do one thing: increase demand for US-produced dairy products, to quote their website. They had a 2003 marketing budget of more than $165 million to do it. In comparison, the National Watermelon Promotion Board has a budget of $1.6 million. The fruit industry plays this game just like everyone else. For example, when you think of vitamin C, what food product comes to mind? If you don't think of oranges and orange juice, you are unusual. Most of us have heard ad nauseum that oranges are a good source of vitamin C. This belief, however, is just another result of good marketing. It is very easy for scientists to get caught in the reductionism web of thinking, even if they have other intentions. Not until recently, after a lifetime of research, did I come to realize how damaging it is to take details out of context and to make subsequent claims about diet and health. Industry uses these details extremely well, and the result is public confusion. Every year, it seems, some new product is being touted as the key to good health. The situation is so bad that quote-unquote health sections of the grocery stores are often stocked more with supplements and special preparations of seemingly magic ingredients than they are with real food. Don't be tricked. The healthiest section of any store is the place where they sell whole foods and vegetables, the produce section. Government. Is it for the people? More people die because of the way they eat than from tobacco use, accidents, or any other lifestyle or environmental factor. We know that the incidence of obesity and diabetes is skyrocketing and that America's health is slipping away, and we know what to blame: diet. So shouldn't the government be leading us to better nutrition? The government can take no greater action to prevent pain and suffering in this country than to tell Americans unequivocally to eat fewer animal products, fewer highly refined plant products, and more whole plant-based foods. It is a message soundly based on the breadth and depth of scientific evidence, and the government could make this clear, as it did with cigarettes. Cigarettes kill, and so do these bad foods. But instead of doing this, the government is saying that animal products, dairy and meat, refined sugar, and fat in your diet are good for you. In the 2002 Food and Nutrition Board report, nutrient recommendations were presented as ranges instead of single numbers, as had been the practice. For good health, we are now advised to consume from 45 to 65% of our calories as carbohydrates. There are ranges for fat and protein as well. Quote, to meet the body's daily energy and nutritional needs while minimizing risk for chronic disease, adults should get 45 to 65% of their calories from carbohydrates, 20 to 35 from fat, and 10 to 35 from protein. The critical assumption of this report is this: the American diet is not only the best there is, but you should now feel free to eat an even richer diet and still be confident that you are, quote, minimizing risk for chronic disease, unquote. Forget any words of caution you may find in this report, With such a range of possibilities, virtually any diet can be advocated as minimizing disease risk. What's amazing is that I could put together a variety of menus all drenched in animal foods and added sugars that conform to these recommended daily allowances. Perhaps the most shocking figure is the upper limit on protein intake. Relative to total calorie intake, only 5 to 6% dietary protein is required to replace the protein regularly excreted by the body as amino acids. About 9 to 10% protein, however, is the amount that has been recommended for the past 50 years to be assured that most people at least get their 5 to 6% quote-unquote requirement. This 9 to 10% recommendation is equivalent to the well-known recommended daily allowance. Almost all Americans exceed this 9 to 10% recommendations. We consume protein within the range of about 11 to 21%, with an average of 15 to 16%. The relatively few people consuming more than 21% protein mostly are those who pump iron, joined by those on high protein diets. Industry mostly develops consultancies with a few publicly visible figures in academia who then take leadership in policy positions outside of academia. However, these industry consultants continue to wear their academic hats. They organize symposia and workshops, write commissioned reviews, chair expert policy groups, and/or become officers of key professional societies. They gravitate toward the leadership positions in science-based organizations that develop significant policy and publicity. Once in these positions, these people then have the opportunity to assemble teams to their liking by choosing committee members, symposia speakers, management staff, and so forth. The kinds of people most helpful to the team are either colleagues with similar prejudices and/or colleagues who are oblivious to who is calling the shots. It's called stacking the deck, and it really works. It seems curious that while government scientists are not allowed to receive personal compensation from the private sector, their colleagues in academia can receive all that they can get. In turn, these conflicted individuals then run the show in collaboration with their government counterparts. However, restricting academics from receiving corporate consultancies is not the answer. That would only drive it underground. Rather, the situation would be best handled by making one's industry connections a matter of public disclosure. Having been a member of several diet and health policy-making expert panels over a 20-year period, I harbored the view that these panels were dedicated to the promotion of consumer health. I no longer believe this to be true. The U.S. National Institutes of Health, NIH, is responsible for funding at least 80 to 90% of all biomedical and nutrition-related research that is published in the scientific literature. To address a range of health topics, the NIH comprises 27 separate institutes and centers, including its two largest, the National Cancer Institute, NCI, and the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute. With a 2015 budget of $30.55 billion, the NIH is the center of the government's gigantic medical research efforts. In terms of nutrition research, however, something is amiss. None of these 27 institutes and centers at the NIH is devoted to nutrition, despite the pivotal nature of nutrition in health, and despite the public interest in the subject. If very few of our tax dollars are used to fund nutrition research, what do they fund? Almost all of the billions of dollars of taxpayer money the NIH spends annually funds projects to develop drugs, supplements, and mechanical devices. In essence, the vast bulk of biomedical research funded by you and me is basic research to discover products that the pharmaceutical industry can develop and market. In 2015, in the executive summary of their report, the scientific panel stated, quote, "The overall body of evidence examined by the 2015 Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee identifies that a healthy dietary pattern is higher in vegetables, fruits, whole grains, low or non-fat dairy, seafood, legumes, and nuts, moderate in alcohol among adults, lower in red and processed meat, and low in sugar-sweetened foods and drinks and refined grains. Of course, in the end, the scientists were only advisors, never a group to let scientists dictate scientific recommendations. Government administrators formulating the final report gutted the executive summary in a blatant effort to bury any anti-industry themes. Any anti-animal food sentiment was replaced or eliminated. When discussing what people might consider cutting back on, they focused on nutrients and not foods, a common tactic to make recommendations harder to understand. I have concluded that when it comes to health, government is not for the people. It is for the food industry and the pharmaceutical industry at the expense of the people. It is a systemic problem where industry, academia, and government combine to determine the health of this country. Big medicine. Whose health are they protecting? Why doesn't the medical system take nutrition seriously? 4 words: money, ego, power, and control. While it is unfair to generalize about individual doctors, it is safe to say that the system they work in, the system that currently takes responsibility for promoting the health of Americans, is failing us. No one knows this better than the tiny minority of doctors who treat their patients from a nutritional perspective. The study he published of 18 patients with heart disease demonstrated the most dramatic reversal of heart disease in the history of medicine, simply by using a low-fat plant-based diet and a minimal amount of cholesterol-reducing medication. Esselstyn has become a champion of dietary treatment of disease, and he has the data to prove his case. But it hasn't been easy. Rather than recognizing him as a hero, some in the medical establishment would rather he disappear. Somewhere in this transition from top-ranked, self-described macho, hard-ass surgeon to dietary advocate, he has become known behind his back as Dr. Sprouts. The medical status quo relies heavily on medication and surgery, to the exclusion of nutrition and lifestyle. Doctors have virtually no training in nutrition and how it relates to health. You should not assume that your doctor has any more knowledge about food and its relation to health than your neighbors and co-workers. It's the situation in which nutritionally untrained doctors prescribe milk and sugar-based meal replacement shakes for overweight diabetics, high-meat, high-fat diets for patients who ask how to lose weight, and extra milk for patients who have osteoporosis. Dr. John McDougall has been advocating a whole foods plant-based diet approach to health longer than any practitioner we know. He has written 10 books, including several that have sold over 500,000 copies each. Through those years, John came to understand why so many physicians claimed diet was controversial. Quote, "The scientist is sitting down at the breakfast table, and in one hand he has a paper that says that cholesterol will rot your arteries and kill you, and in the other hand he has a fork shoveling bacon and eggs into his mouth, and he says, 'There's something confusing here. I'm confused.' And that's the controversy. That's all it is." Academic researchers may be furiously trying to find a pill that will treat the symptoms of obesity, but not be devoting any time or money to teaching people how to live a healthier life. Dr. Angel writes, "In terms of education, medical students and house officers, under the constant tutelage of industry representatives, learn to rely on drugs and devices more than they probably should. As the critics of medicine so often charge, young physicians learn that for every problem there is a pill, and a drug company representative to explain it. They also become accustomed to receiving gifts and favors from an industry that uses these courtesies to influence their continuing education. The academic medical centers, in allowing themselves to become research outposts for industry, contribute to the overemphasis on drugs and devices. 20% of all new drugs have serious unknown side effects, and more than 100,000 Americans die every year from correctly taking their properly prescribed medication. This is one of the leading causes of death in America. Both Esselstyn and McDougall have now been denied re-entry into the establishment after a headline-making success at healing people with a nutritional approach. You can focus on the money, according to John and S. 80% of St. Helena's and 65% of the Cleveland Clinic's respective incomes were generated by traditional heart disease treatments, surgical interventions. But it's something more than just money. It may also be the intellectual threat that the patient should be in control and not the doctor, that something as simple as food could be more powerful than all the knowledge of pills and high-tech procedures. It may be the lack of credible nutrition education in medical school. It may be the influence of the drug industry. Whatever it is, it has become clear that the medical industry in this country is not protecting our health as it should. Humans are strongly social creatures, and those who currently eat a whole foods plant-based diet remain a tiny minority of the population. I believe that a great many of our behavioral choices are made with a strong, mostly subconscious deference to social norms, and many people, including patients and healthcare providers, remain uninterested in trying a plant-based diet. There are no or very few satisfactory mechanisms to get insurance to pay adequately for most patients to participate in physician-led group nutrition programs at a tiny fraction of this cost. This is a fundamental barrier to the widespread practice of nutrition as medicine. Academia. I prefer not to blame industry for this problem because I understand, even though I often disagree with, their main purpose: to produce products and services that will sell. Shareholder interests, jobs, and revenue matter, otherwise there is no business. Neither do I hold responsible medical practitioners and administrators, because they mostly rely on the highly reductionist scientific evidence that is provided to them. Practitioners also suffer from an almost total lack of training in nutrition, a holistic science with its own set of principles and criteria. We might also blame institutions not mentioned here, the media, for example, who are responsible for disseminating this information. For the most part, however, media communicate what they are told by those who create information. On the question of the government sector, it is my experience that although most government personnel concerned with human health research do their best to provide reliable facts to the public, their interpretation of these facts into regulations and public policy may become quite subjective. It is during this interpretation phase of evaluating scientific evidence that outside corporate interests can best exert their influence. I have seen this interplay between industry and government sectors becoming so significant in so many ways that it is fair to say that government and industry now act, in effect, as one mega institution. The impact of academia on society goes well beyond the ivory tower. Its reach into the intellectual, social, and corporate fabric of our society is overwhelming. Academia, aside from educating in the fall of 2016 21 million college-age young people, conducts or oversees most of our basic research in the health sciences. When we speak of academia, however, we do not refer only to the university campuses where most of this information is produced. Significant amounts of work by academics occurs outside of their institutions, and these activities are related to and strongly influenced by their academic reputation and continued quote-unquote membership and responsibilities within academia. One of the more prominent of these activities is helping to develop public health policies, projects, and services, usually by sitting on committees of experts. The conditions that encourage the loss of academic freedom are getting worse. More and more of the lecturers and researchers in our universities are non-tenure track employees whose jobs are vulnerable to the wishes and control of their employers. In effect, they are contractors carrying out their employers' propaganda. Without tenure, they can be released from their positions at any time when their opinions and findings run afoul of gutless authorities. In 1980, 68% of academics held tenure or tenure-track positions. Now this number is only 32%. This means that 68% are non-tenure track, when the American Association of University Professors recommends that the number of non-tenure track academics on staff should not exceed 15%. Academia is no longer what it once was. I am now convinced that among the sectors of industry, government, and healthcare discussed in the first edition of this book, academia is more to blame for the public confusion and distortion of health information than any other sector. However, it is critically important to know that this is not the fault of the vast majority of academic researchers and teachers. Rather, the blame lies with those few academics, however few they may be, who are happy to oblige corporate interests for their own self-serving reasons. Repeating histories. The constitutional nature of disease concept meant that disease is not the result of one organ or cell, or one reaction gone awry, or the result of one external cause acting independently. It is the result of multiple systems throughout the body breaking down. Opposing this view was the local theory of disease, which said that disease is caused by a single external agent acting at a specific site in the body. At that time, a fierce fight was underway between those who believed in diet and those who supported surgery and the emerging use of drugs. The local disease proponents argued that disease could be cut out or treated in isolation with chemicals. In contrast, those who favored diet and lifestyle believed that disease was a symptom resulting from the constitutional characteristics of the whole body. Hardly anybody knows, for example, that the father of Western medicine, Hippocrates, advocated diet as the chief way to prevent and treat disease, or that George McIlwain knew that diet was the way to prevent and treat disease, or that the man instrumental in founding the American Cancer Society, Frederick L. Hoffman, knew that diet was the way to prevent and treat disease. How did we go from knowing that the best athletes in the ancient Greek Olympics must have consumed a plant-based diet to fearing that vegetarians don't get enough protein? How did we get to a place where the healers of our society, our doctors, know little if anything about nutrition, where our medical institutions denigrate the subject, where using prescription drugs and going to hospitals is the third leading cause of death? People are beginning to understand the conclusions of scientific literature and are changing their lives for the better. Never before has there been such a mountain of empirical research supporting a whole foods plant-based diet. Now, for example, we can obtain images of the arteries in the heart and then show conclusively, as Drs. Dean Ornish and Campbell Jr. have done, that a whole foods plant-based diet reverses heart disease. We now have a deep and broad range of evidence showing that a whole foods plant-based diet is best for the heart. We now have a deep and broad range of evidence showing that a whole foods plant-based diet is best for preventing and possibly also for treating cancer. We now have a deep and broad range of evidence showing that a whole foods plant-based diet is best for diabetes and autoimmune diseases. We now have a deep and broad range of evidence showing that a whole foods plant-based diet is best for our kidneys, bones, eyes, and brains. Furthermore, I have hope for the future because of our new ability to exchange information across the country and around the world. A much greater proportion of the world population is literate, and a much greater proportion of that population has the luxury of choosing what they eat from a wide variety of readily accessible foods. Afterword. There is no medical protocol of pills and procedures that can offer more human health than does nutrition. Yet strangely, the medical profession does not even accord nutrition the status of medical specialty among 26 officially recognized medical specialties. Even more suspect, nutrition is not taught in medical schools other than a few minimalist lectures in some schools only. My definition is quite simple. Nutrition is the biological expression of food that promotes health. Malnutrition is its opposite. Traditionally, we investigate, teach, and market nutrition primarily by focusing on individual nutrients, individual mechanisms by which nutrients function, and individual outcomes. This is reductionism. Nutrition works through the concept of holism, which represents a powerful symphony of countless nutrients and nutrient-like chemicals working by countless mechanisms to produce a highly dynamic, almost seamless series of outcomes. Good outcomes when working well, not so good when not working well. Efforts are constantly being made by an oligarchy composed of industry, government, academia, medical practice, and media institutions to proactively deny this knowledge to the public. Why? It's simple. They fear that this knowledge just might offer far cheaper and more effective solutions for health problems than does their products and programs. The oligarchy wants to protect its business, and too often they do it with abandon. It's business 101 on a very grand scale. Knowledge is power, and these institutions have power to control that knowledge. Even more ominously, preventing that knowledge from reaching the public allows them to acquire revenue that can be used to control that knowledge further. It is self-generating power, a perpetual motion machine. The oligarchy extracts a price from us at both ends. As taxpayers, we pay for subsidies to produce the food that is killing us. Then we pay for expensive pills and procedures when we get sick. When the oligarchy actively prevents this knowledge from being provided to the public, it is immoral, especially when the public's money is used to create that knowledge. Thanks for watching. If you have made it all the way to the end, please leave a comment. I hope you're doing well, and I hope you take this information to increase your level of health, and I wish you well. Take care.